Good morning, everyone, and welcome to D7 of this public inquiry.
Morning, Chair. The first witness sitting in the witness box is Mrs. Susan Hogg.
Would you please repeat after me? I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Sit down, please.
Thank you.
Give us your name.
Susan Hogg.
Susan Hogg. Mrs. Hogg, I want to ask you, please, for a little assistance about what you did by way of occupation in the 1980s.
I worked for Sir Peter Morrison as his diary secretary in the Department of Employment.
I think you began working as a civil servant in the Health and Safety Executive.
In 77, yes.
Yeah, I'm simply taking this from a statement you made to the inquiry in December last year. And you recalled, I'm looking at your paragraph 2, and for the Chair and panel it's behind tab 1 in the file. You remembered receiving a phone call saying that one of the ministers was looking for a diary secretary?
That's correct, yes.
Which you thought was in 1983?
Yes.
But you couldn't remember precisely which month. You thought probably September.
It was probably about September, yes.
And you took the position, ending up working as a diary secretary for Peter Morrison from between 1983 and 1985.
That's correct.
And what were your functions as his diary secretary?
Well, in those days it was a paper diary, so it was a little bit more complicated than it is presently, but I was responsible for organising all of his departmental commitments, including regional visits and all of his many meetings that he had throughout the day with various people.
Help us about this, Mrs. Hogg, if you would. Where were you based?
I was based in Caxton House on Tothill Street.
So in London?
In London, yes.
And between 1983 and 1985, am I right in thinking that Peter Morrison was a minister?
That's correct, Minister of State for Employment.
Employment at that time. And I think you found yourself working long hours. Very.
It was regular that we'd start work before 8 o'clock and till at least 11 o'clock at night. And sometimes I signed out of the late book as late as 2 o'clock in the morning and still had to be back at my desk for 8 o'clock the following morning. And that's why you spend such a short time in those kind of roles, because it really is very difficult to sustain more than 2 years.
And if you don't mind me asking, just so we get a fix on it, I think you were in your early 20s at the time.
I was, yes.
And you say, and I'm looking at your paragraph 5, that you got on very well with him and he was kind to you, especially when your father passed away.
He was, yes.
But you say he had some serious issues.
Yes, he clearly had an alcohol problem. He used to start drinking at lunchtime and he'd drink a bottle of vodka quite easily by tea time, and then he'd start drinking whiskey. But he also smoked very heavily as well. And in those days you could smoke in the office.
Yeah. And was that something you became aware of from the off, or was it
yes,
a habit which increased and developed during the time you worked for him?
No, he was like it from word go.
You say, looking at your paragraph 6, that he moved in very high circles.
Yes.
The Duke of Westminster, Prince Charles among his friends.
Yes.
And his sister was lady-in-waiting to the Queen.
Yes, she still is.
You spoke about his temper, though. Was there something that you particularly remembered?
Yeah, he used to get very upset. He was regularly called on by Buckingham Palace to escort Princess Margaret, and he used to get very distressed at that, and he'd be in a bad mood most of the day if that was what his duties were that day.
And what was the source of his distress?
I just don't think he liked doing that job, but he was regularly called to escort her.
Yeah. Do you remember, although not the date itself, but an occasion when Peter Morrison received a phone call, and I'm looking again at your statement at paragraph 7 now, received a phone call demanding that he go to Downing Street
Yes.
in order to see the Prime Minister?
Yes.
And although you can't recall the date precisely, you say that your father died in November 1984, and you thought it was just before that.
Yes, and it was clearly something very serious, because he was demanded, he had to go to Downing Street instantly, and he came back in a very foul mood, and shortly afterwards I recall that he was then taken in to see Sir Michael Quinlan, who was the permanent secretary
At the Education Department?
At Department of Employment.
Oh,
yes.
Employment.
Yes, and I also remember quite clearly, again around the same time, within days of each other, him being have to go to see the Chief Whip. So it was clear something had happened, but we weren't knowledgeable as to what had happened.
So he'd been to see the Prime Minister sometime before November 1984 when your father passed away.
Yes.
Came back in a bad mood. Around the same time sees Michael Quinlan, Permanent Secretary at Employment.
Yes.
And also the Chief Whip.
Yes.
Now, during your time working for him, did you discover that he had a friendship with Eliza Manningham Buller, who was to become Director General of MI5?
Yes. It was actually over phone calls that he used to phone us when he got home at night, and regularly I would hear him saying, and they'd be giggling in the background, and he'd be saying, "Stop it, Eliza, stop it." Well, I didn't know who Eliza was until she actually visited the department.
Now, pause there for a moment, Mrs. Hogg. It may be me. You say it was when he got home at night and regularly... Forgive me, it was... I'm just trying to... because the transcript's moving up, but it was something about he used to phone us.
Yes.
What do you mean by that?
He used to phone into the office to make sure... because how he worked, his pattern of work was that he'd leave the office possibly about 5 o'clock in the evening. He'd go home and have his dinner, and then he'd come back into the office sometimes at 11 o'clock at night.
Right, pause there if you would. Now, you told us you worked in Tothill Street.
Yes.
Which is in Westminster.
Yes.
And where was home for him?
Chester Street,
Right.
in Belgravia.
So not too far away.
No.
And so he'd go home for dinner, and he'd return to the office where you would still be working. At what sort of time in the evening?
11, 12, regularly. That
And
happened.
was it at that time of night you're telling us he used to receive these phone calls?
Probably before that, before he returned to the office, and obviously he had a visitor there, and it turned out to be Miss Manningham Buller. But
I'm just going back to phone calls because
Yes.
we might be confusing two things. Well, what I'd like to understand is you talked about phone calls that you became aware of.
Yes.
And because he would say things like, "Stop it,
Yes.
Eliza," and you mentioned in your statement there'd be giggling, so it was
Yes.
a chummy sort of
Yes.
phone call that you assumed it was Eliza Manningham Buller.
I didn't assume it was her at the time.
But since.
It was only when I found out that it was Eliza Manningham Buller. I didn't know what she did for an occupation. I actually, at the time, because I was innocent and young, I thought she was his girlfriend.
Yeah. Okay. How was it you heard these phone calls? Were you in the same office as him, or...?
He'd be phoning me to find out what was happening the next day, or to discuss something that we'd sent him in his red box.
Yeah.
So he regularly phoned into the office,
Yeah.
and then we'd find out if he was going to come back in later, and we'd still need to be there when he got back.
Yeah, I'm still struggling to understand how you overheard these phone calls.
Because I'd be talking to him on the phone.
Oh, so I see.
Yes.
And so So he was talking to somebody in the background who
Yes.
was... So you weren't overhearing phone calls that he was having with this
No.
Eliza.
No.
He was on the phone to you, and in the background
I
you could hear him say things like, "Stop it, Eliza," and they'd be giggling.
Yes.
I'm with you. Did you ever see the person you thought he was talking to at that time? Did somebody ever come into the office who announced that she was Eliza Manningham-Buller?
Yes, she didn't announce she was Eliza Manningham-Buller. I was sitting, my desk had my back to the door, and the door opened and I heard a voice say, "Is Peter in?" And his private secretary said, "Oh, he's in a meeting at the moment." She said, "Oh, tell him I popped in." But I recognised the voice from over the telephone.
I see.
And I asked his private secretary who it was, and he said, "Oh, that's Eliza Manningham-Buller." So my initial response was, "Well, what's she doing here in the department?" Because I just thought she was a friend. And he told me that she worked for MI5 and she'd probably come to see Sir Michael Quinlan because of the miners' strike.
Right. So not to do with him, but to do with
No.
the miners' strike that was going on.
Well, we
at the time.
think that's what she'd come to see Sir Michael Quinlan
So
for.
that was supposition.
It was supposition, yes.
Now, you mentioned to us a little earlier that Peter Morrison had been called into Downing Street, and then he'd had a discussion around the same period of time with Michael Quinlan, Permanent Secretary, as well as the Chief Whip.
Yes.
Who was the Chief Whip at the time, do you know?
I don't remember actually, but he was very big friends with Archie Hamilton, who was a Conservative whip,
Yeah.
and used to regularly meet up with Archie Hamilton, but I don't remember the name of the Chief Whip.
What you do say in paragraph 10 is that you didn't know why he'd been
No.
called into all of these meetings, but you do say nothing seemed to change as a result, but he was in a bad mood for a long time.
Yes.
To the point where you remark that he went through a period of putting abusive notes on submissions that were in his red box, which you had to Tipex out.
Yes.
Abusive submissions or notes to whom?
They were just, he would just criticise everything that went to him in his red box, and he regularly called civil servants Martians, and he would write across the submission that had gone to him, "This is Martian." So I would have to Tipex it out so it didn't offend anybody.
Yeah. Or offend Martians.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. I think so you stopped working for him, you say, after Christmas 1985, and you were promoted and moved on to work with Sir Brian Nicholson.
That's correct, yes.
Who was?
He was the chairman of the Manpower Services Commission.
Yeah. And you note that Peter Morrison died, Sir Peter as he was then, in
Yes.
1995. Did you attend the funeral?
I did.
Did you notice if Eliza Manningham-Buller
No,
was
she
there or
wasn't
not?
there, no.
All right.
Mrs Thatcher and her husband were there, and people like the Duke of Westminster, and a lot of his very close friends.
Where was the funeral?
It was at Fonthill in Wiltshire in his family home.
Well, thank you very much, Mrs Hogg. That's
Thank
all I
you.
need to ask you. I'll see if the chair and panel have any questions for you.
No, thank you. We have no questions.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Chair, the next witness is Baroness Manningham-Buller.
swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the
and
truth.
nothing but the truth.
Sit down if you would, please. Can you give us your full name?
Elizabeth Lydia Manningham Buller.
Right, if you kindly turn to your left, don't mind me too much. Lady Manningham Buller, can I ask you, please, first of all, to confirm that you made a statement to the inquiry, which we have in our files, which was dated the 5th of February 2018. Mistake?
Yes.
It's 2019.
Sorry.
No need to apologise. I'm going to have it put up on screen because there are just a couple of corrections I think you've asked to be made to it. INQ 004047, please. And you'll see to your right, the statement will appear on the screen. You've got a hard copy. Can I confirm, do you have the letter that was sent to the inquiry of the 8th of March, which corrects two of the
I've seen it.
You've
Yes,
seen
I
it.
haven't
Well,
got it.
yeah, I'm sure you'll trust me. I've got the letter in front of me. Paragraph 3, in the 4th line, which begins, "been endorsed by me," and this refers to a letter that we looked at yesterday and we'll look again with you. The word endorsed, you wish to replace with the word signed. Is that correct? And paragraph 4, which currently reads, "I do not remember whether Anthony Duff was aware of my connection with Peter Morrison, and as far as I recall, I didn't have any conversations with him about this matter." You've asked for that first sentence to be replaced in this way, with "Anthony Duff must have been aware of my connection with Peter Morrison given what is contained in the papers, but I don't remember this, and as far as I recall, I didn't have any conversations with him about this matter."
That's correct.
So I've simply read from a letter that was sent to the inquiry a couple of days ago now. Thank you. With that in mind, first of all, please, tell us something about your career in MI5.
I joined in 1974 and I did a variety of jobs. At the time of the, I think, in which the inquiry is most closely interested, I was in the Secretariat of the Security Service with responsibility for the oversight of its foreign relationships with foreign services, and towards the end of the 80s, 87, I was promoted and became in charge of the work on Middle East terrorism. At the end of the 80s, I went to Washington in the embassy, and then I had a series of jobs in the 90s until in 1997 I became Deputy Head of the Service, becoming Director General in 2002, and standing down, retiring from that in 2007.
Thank you very much. Now, tell us something, please, about your relationship at that time with Peter Morrison.
Peter Morrison was a friend of mine. Our fathers were friends, known each other in politics, and he was a friend of mine for much of the 80s.
And had you ever stayed at the family home in Islay?
Yes, I did once.
And how would you describe your friendship with him?
We were quite good friends, not close. He was not somebody who confided in people very much. I saw him generally socially with other people. We had a number of friends in common. And occasionally I had dinner with him.
And so on average, if you can average it out, how regularly do you think you saw him a year during that period?
I find that, I really don't remember, but I'm guessing about once a month, twice a month possibly.
You've heard, have you, the evidence given by Sue Hogg?
I've heard most of it, not the very end of it.
All right.
I've been here.
But you've had access to her witness statement,
I have.
from which it doesn't depart. She recalls phone calls which she would have with Peter Morrison when he was Minister of State for employment between 1983 and 1985, when she could hear in the background while Peter Morrison was talking to her, conversation taking place between him and somebody he referred to as Eliza. Is it possible that that was you?
It might have been once or twice, but nothing like the number of times that she mentioned. And this fits with a concern I developed sometime after this, that he was suggesting to people that I was his girlfriend when I wasn't.
Yeah.
And that was a reason why, towards the end of the 80s, one of the reasons I saw less of him.
Yeah.
But I certainly wasn't in his house as regularly as the impression that she got. But I wonder if he wanted to give that impression.
Yeah. But on the odd occasion,
Yes.
nobody's criticising you for it, or him for that matter, but on the odd occasion, if Mrs. Hogg heard in the background the odd giggles and "Stop it, Eliza," that's something that has possibly happened.
It might have happened, but I do not think that there was anything in the regularity with which we saw each other, which was irregular, that would have made her think this was happening the whole time, and therefore I'm suspicious, not of what she said, but what the impression he was wishing to give was.
I see. And do you read anything into the impression that he was trying to give at that time?
Only speculation.
Yeah, about his sexuality?
Possibly.
Yeah. Now, while we have Mrs. Hogg's evidence in mind, do you remember a visit to the department to see Michael Quinlan?
I certainly didn't go to see Michael Quinlan, whom I only met after he'd retired from the public service, when he was the director of Ditchley. I was much too junior to go and see people like him. I do remember once dropping in, I think not at... Well, I thought it was the Department of Energy. It wasn't Tothill Street. Once dropping in to see Peter Morrison. I think that was in what is now Thames House, the headquarters of the Security Service, which was then partly the Department of Energy, I think.
Well, he wasn't Minister of State for Energy until June 1987.
Or maybe my memory is faulty then.
But he was Minister of State for Trade and Industry between September 85 and September 86.
I'm not sure.
You're not sure? Was there any possibility that you visited the Department of Employment during the miners' strike?
Yes.
So that's a possibility?
Yes.
Yeah.
But not to see Michael Quinlan.
Okay. And not to see Peter Morrison?
No.
Right. Let's move on. I'd like you, please, if you would, from the file in front of you, but we'll put these documents up on screen, to look at a document behind your divider 9, and the panel have got this as well, and we'll put it up on screen, please, CAB 000126. Presumably this won't have been a document or a letter that you saw at the time.
No.
But let's see if you can assist us with it and its content. It's dated the 6th of January. It's to Robert Armstrong, who was at the time Cabinet Secretary, and it's from Sir Anthony Duff, who was Director General of the Service at the time. Is that right?
Yes.
And it reads this way: you may recall that in November 1983, you told my predecessor that you'd heard from the Chief Whip that rumours were circulating to the effect that Peter Morrison MP had been picked up by the police for importuning. Neither the DPP's office nor Special Branch were able to substantiate the rumours at that time. I think you will wish to know that a member of my staff was told by a friend a couple of months ago that Morrison had been caught soliciting in a public lavatory and had been lucky not to be charged, date unspecified. And more recently, a second friend told the same member of staff that Lord Cranborne had been telling the story quite openly to a large group of people. In other words, the rumours persist and have become more widespread. On this second occasion. It was said that a Labour MP had been charged with a similar offence at the same time. It appears that Dr Roger Thomas, MP for Carmarthen, was indeed arrested at the end of September 1983. It seems probable, therefore, that the current rumours are based on the original 1983 story and not necessarily on a repetition. Now, before I ask you a couple of questions about that, if we turn in your bundle, please, to tab 10, and we put up on screen CAB 000099, we'll see that this was the response from Sir Robert Armstrong, as he was then, of the 13th of January to Sir Anthony Duff. Thank you for your letter of the 6th of January about Peter Morrison MP. I do indeed remember what passed in November 1983. I've made sure that the Prime Minister is aware that there is a potential problem. If you pick up any further evidence or rumours, I should be very glad to have them. Going back, please, to the 6th of January letter behind tab 9, on screen CAB 000126. Did you know anything about that? Those rumours? Were you the member of staff who passed them on?
I think I must have been. I only saw this letter after I'd made my statement to the inquiry, when it came out of the Cabinet Office, I believe, papers. And I think it probable that the second paragraph is my report, based on a report made by me, but I'm not 100% sure.
That a member of my staff, so if that was you, was told by a third person, a friend, a couple of months ago, which would take us into the back end of 1985, that Morrison had been caught soliciting in a public laboratory and been lucky not to be charged. So if that information had been imparted to you by a third party, is it likely, and certainly given the other information we've seen, is it likely that you would have passed that information on to the service?
Yes. I would have regarded it as my duty to do so.
And more recently, a second friend told the same member of staff that Lord Cranborne had been telling the story quite openly to a large group of people. Now, if it's you, then you're the same member of staff who passed on that information as well, and if you've done so, presumably for the same reason you've just given us. Do you have now any independent recollection of either of those two pieces of information?
I don't.
Can I, as it were, fast forward to another document behind the final tab in your bundle, and to go up on screen, CAB 000123. In fact, there's one other document I may well come back to. This one is from P.J. Walker, if you look at the second page, and he was the DG, I think, in July 1987, which is the date of this letter. Again to Sir Robert Armstrong. Dear Robert, on the 19th of June, in connection with the briefing of new ministers, you told me of the concern expressed to you by Peter Morrison, Minister of State at the Department of Energy, about a number of unpleasant rumours that had circulated about him in recent years. On the 2nd of July, and there's a redaction, saw Morrison in his office to give him the normal security briefing. After the briefing, Morrison, without prompting, raised the subject of the rumours, mentioning his discussion with you and with Peter Gregson. He then gave an account of what he described as the unfounded and malicious allegations of homosexuality that had been made against him. These had begun in January 1982, when he was Parliamentary Under-Secretary at the Department of Employment. Norman Tebbit, the Secretary of State, had said that he had heard that the police were investigating Morrison, quote, as a queer, unquote. Morrison denied that he was a homosexual and had so informed Tebbit. He'd also spoken to the Chief Whip. The next, quote, whisperings, unquote, took place in 1983, after the Cecil Parkinson affair. On that occasion, he'd spoken to the Deputy Chief Whip. In 1984 and 1985, he was conscious of press interest in him, but this died down, and the stories did not revive until September 1986 in the aftermath of the Jeffrey Archer episode. Again, the rumours were imprecise and unpleasant. He'd taken legal advice and was told that unless something more tangible appeared, he should let the matter rest. And then over the page, in October-November 1986, events took a turn for the worse. And this is the period, Lady Manningham-Buller, that you wrote the two memos that we will come to in a short while. Two Mirror Group journalists had hired a private aircraft flown from Glasgow to his country home on the Isle of Islay and camped on his doorstep for 2 or 3 days. He refused to see them, and in November and December various attempts were made to telephone him. The journalists left messages saying they were about to publish stories. Acting on legal advice, he'd refused to rise to the bait and had said nothing that was newsworthy to anyone. Morrison then mentioned the stories about his alleged homosexual behaviour which surfaced in his Chester constituency during the general election. Unfortunately, his election agent, and this is something we looked at yesterday, in a well-meaning but clumsy attempt to spare Morrison embarrassment, had spoken without Morrison's authority or knowledge to the Labour candidate. She chose to do so in a back street of all places. Morrison feared that if his agent's approach reached the wrong ears, it could be misrepresented as an attempted cover-up. In answer to a question, Morrison said that he didn't know who was behind the stories. In his view, the Mirror Group was simply out to get copy. He thought, however, that the rumours might have been inspired by a fellow Conservative. He based this assumption on a cryptic comment by a senior press officer in the Conservative Central Office who had warned him that one's real enemies are often on one's own side. Morrison didn't ask for advice but was reminded of the need to be on his guard both in this country and abroad against behaviour which, however innocent, could be misrepresented. As a public figure, he needed to choose his friends with care. Morrison was grateful for this advice and said that he already took care, but from now on would take even more precautions. Were you aware of all of this going on in the background? As I say, we'll come to 1986 and your direct involvement, but were you aware of this going on the following year, in July 1987, at the time that you were... you weren't in the Secretariat at this time?
No, by this stage I was on Middle Eastern terrorism.
All right. But I think you will probably agree that at least some of the information in paragraph 4 came from the information you imparted in November 1986.
Well, it's the same as it.
Yeah. All right. And finally, just to look at one other document which perhaps you can help us with before we come to the material that most directly concerns you. Can we go back to Divider 10 and this time look at a 1988 document, CAB 000099 at page 3. This is a letter to Patrick Walker on the 2nd of February 1988. It comes from the Cabinet Office from Sir Robin Butler now. Dear Patrick, you will be aware of previous correspondence between your predecessor and mine about Peter Morrison. Do you have it?
I think I probably have it, but it's not at tab 10.
Oh,
I've certainly seen it before.
Is it not? I'm sorry about that. It should be the final document in behind tab 10.
No, I beg your pardon. No, it's sorry, I missed it. Yes, I have
No,
got
it's the
it.
third page. It's
Yep,
page
sorry,
3, but it's the final.
Yep, got it.
I call it the final document. All right.
Apologies.
No, not at all. Dear Patrick, you'll be aware of previous correspondence between your predecessor and mine about Peter Morrison MP. Last year there was a proposal that as Minister of State, Department of Energy, he should make a visit to Moscow. Since the rumours about Mr. Morrison were likely to have reached the ears of the Russians, and it was thought possible that an attempt would be mounted to compromise him, precautions were prepared by which he should stay overnight at the embassy, be accompanied at all times when out of the embassy, and avoid attempts to offer him excessive hospitality. However, in the end, it was decided that it would be simpler on all grounds if Mr. Parkinson carried out the visit, and so Mr. Morrison did not go. There are now plans being drawn up for Mr. Morrison to make an extensive series of visits in the Far East in late September, early October of this year, primarily to promote the interests of the United Kingdom offshore supplies industry. It is at present proposed that this tour should include 2 nights in the Republic of China. Mr. Morrison would stay in Beijing, and precautions like those prepared for the visit to Moscow could be put in place. I'm inclined to think that given such precautions and Mr. Morrison's acceptance of them, he could be advised to undertake the trip, provided that our ambassador in Beijing was also discreetly warned of the risk that attempts might be made to exploit the earlier rumours. But before giving advice on those lines, I should be grateful for the views of you and of C, to whom I'm copying this letter, also sending a copy to Patrick Wright. Now, did you ever become aware, when you were working for MI5, of the security issues around Peter Morrison?
The reason I reported, as I did, and we're going to come on to, was because although homosexuality, which is at this stage, the early stages of what was being talked about, confusion between that and paedophilia, I think, that potentially made him vulnerable to blackmail and to pressure, and therefore there was a security issue, which is why I reported what I heard later on. But I didn't, I mean, this letter of Robin Butler's I've never seen till the inquiry, and I didn't know that this was happening.
Of course, Peter Morrison had denied being homosexual at the time.
Yeah.
Some of the information that the service had was that he had a penchant for small boys.
Yes.
Both of those things, are you saying, would have made him susceptible to blackmail?
Of course.
Whether true or false?
Yeah.
Because?
Because, I mean, obviously more so if true, but they would make him vulnerable to, in this case, foreign operations to exploit those tendencies.
Right. If he had no tendencies, though, do you still think he was vulnerable in that way?
I don't know the answer to that question.
All right. Can we therefore look, please, at your own involvement? Let's go, please, in your bundle to that document behind tab 4. We've all seen it before, but let's put it back up on the screen. INQ 004040, please. Now, we have 5 documents here, 2 of which I think you made clear you had never seen before until they were shown to you by the inquiry, and those are the letters of the 18th of November and the letter of the 17th of December of 1986. So if you like, what I call the decision letters about what was going to happen. But here we have on the 4th of November 1986 a letter to Sir Robert from Sir Anthony Duff, DG at the time. Your letter of the 13th of January referred to the case of Peter Morrison. We've looked at that. You'll remember that was the response to the 6th of January letter, so we looked at that pair of letters a little earlier. The stories about him persist. Have you got the right page?
Yep.
The stories about him persist. A member of my staff was told last month by Donald Stewart, the Conservative Party agent for Westminster, that he heard from 2 sources that Morrison has a penchant for small boys. He gave no details, nor the date of any alleged activities, and didn't reveal his sources. He gave the impression of having received the information recently, but this might simply reflect the fact that Morrison has only recently taken up his position in the Conservative Central Office and has therefore only recently come into Stewart's orbit. The information itself could still be old. And as a matter of history, you may not know this personally, but as a matter of history, between September 1986 and June 1987, Peter Morrison became the Conservative Party Deputy Chairman. And so that would explain the reference to his position in the Conservative Central Office, presumably.
Yes.
Which is covered by the period of the letter and the information we're about to deal with. The information itself could still be old. The position is, therefore, that we are still not clear whether the stories about Morrison are a reflection of the 1983 rumour or are based on something more recent. It does seem rather important to seek to resolve the matter, one way or another if possible. There must, I suppose, be a real possibility that Morrison will be a candidate for office again at some stage, and we should then be confronted by the need to consider these stories in the security context. It would be preferable, if possible, to dispose of them or confirm them before then. The first step would be to talk to Stuart, and then over the page. At the present stage, however, and especially in the light of the Geoffrey Archer case, the risk of political embarrassment to the government is rather greater than the security danger. I wonder if, as a first step, the Chief Whip might think it appropriate to question Stuart. The security service could do this if necessary, and we do have the impression that Stuart meant his information to reach our ears, but I would just as soon that we didn't get directly involved for the time being. So that was the position then. And before we move on from this document, if you go back to the first page at the top, do you see your initials with a date, the 3rd of November? Now, the date of the letter is the 4th of November. Your initials are dated the 3rd of November. First of all, why have you initialed this document?
When I was trained in the security service, and all the records were paper, and a document was marked to you to see, which this was, you signed it and dated to show you'd seen it, precisely for the reason that we're here today, that it was a record of what you'd seen.
Right.
I'm afraid I think that I got the date wrong, because this would not have been written by me or prepared by me. I was 5 levels under the DG, as it were, in the layers at that stage. I think it was shown to me afterwards, and probably it should say the 4th. And that's the only explanation I can suggest.
There may be one other possibility, because you wrote 2 internal memos.
Yes.
Imparting information to the service. One is dated the 11th of November and the other the 13th. If it is an error, is it possible you might have written the 3rd when you meant the 13th?
Conceivably, but I think that there would have been a big delay then between the 4th of November and the letter getting
Exactly,
to
that would be 9 days, and it wouldn't make much sense for you to be shown a letter 9 days after it had gone. Whenever it was seen by you, why should it be seen by you? A letter of this nature from the DG, you say that you were 5 levels below him in the hierarchy. It was going to the Cabinet Secretary, and it was a letter setting out the possible steps that might be taken towards information about the persistent stories, which by this stage you hadn't been directly involved in.
Well, I think that's... I've thought about that question myself, because in the normal course of events, why would I see this letter?
Yeah.
Because the reporting that you're going to come on to isn't days later. And I believe the answer to that is that I was the source of the information in January 1986 in the thing under tab 9, and therefore the Director General knew that I was reporting things I heard about Morrison. I was not the source of the information from Donald Stewart, but because of that, I think the explanation is because of that background, I was shown a copy of this letter.
So, as it were, trying to join the dots as best you can all these years after, you think because you were likely to have been the member of staff who passed on those 2 pieces of information in January 1986, you've been asked to look at this letter after it's gone. The purpose of that being?
To note that this
It's
was
simply for your
yes,
information,
yes.
is it? So it keeps you, what, abreast of
Well,
developments?
If I was, because if I must have produced evidence, I must have produced information for the service before this.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I wouldn't have seen this.
No.
And I think it's the 1986, or there may have been something that is not on the record, which should be.
Yeah. But so that we understand, please, but the purpose, if that's right, the purpose then of you seeing this letter is for what? Is it for your information?
Yes.
And what's the purpose of it being for your information?
It must be because I was the source of some of the earlier information.
But what, to keep you
Yes.
updated?
Yeah.
All right. But what you're saying is, in the second paragraph, after the words, the stories about him persist, a member of my staff was told last month by Donald Stewart, you are not that member of staff on this occasion.
No.
All right. But clearly, at least at this stage, in Sir Anthony Duff's mind, is Stewart ought to be spoken to, ideally by the Chief Whip, Security Service keeping in the background for the time being. Can you think of any reason why the Security Service were going to keep in the background at this point?
This is the first occasion where children are mentioned.
Yeah.
And obviously, looking back on this letter many years later, the fact that that isn't highlighted and put in a prominent part of the letter is shocking. But the service at that stage very much focused on security issues, and the concern, as you can see from paragraph 3, that was expressed was that Morrison would get into office again and then be subject to vulnerable to blackmail potentially. That was the narrow focus at that stage.
No.
And anyway, even if as one wished had been the case, that the reference to children was given prominence, it would have been to pass it to the police and make sure that they had that information. That should have been what had happened.
Although it never did.
Yeah.
You appreciated that.
Yeah. I didn't. I mean, all these papers have racked my memory.
Yeah, of course.
But it didn't, no. But
No.
that wasn't my decision.
No. But no decision was ever made to pass it on to the police. The issue was looked at very narrowly as one of a security issue and a
Yeah.
future security issue.
Yes.
Should Peter Morrison be a
Yes.
candidate for office? Because
That's right.
if he was, as appears to be the case, the deputy chair of the Conservative Party working out of central office, the one thing he wasn't at that time was in government.
Yeah.
And so would it be right to conclude that in that position he didn't have the same security risk as he might do if he was a minister again?
It would be right to conclude that.
All right. Let's please then go behind tab 5 for you, for us, INQ 004036, please. Now, this is the first of the two memoranda that you prepared at the time, and you'll see under your name in type the date, the 11th of November. So this memorandum comes a week after Anthony Duff's letter has gone off to Robert Armstrong, which we just looked at. It reads this way. A friend told me on November, it looks like originally typed was the 11th, but overwritten 10th. Would you have typed this or had a secretary type it in those days?
A secretary.
That there had been a newspaper report, and then we see a typewritten asterisk, reference below the date, the star of the 3rd of November 1986. Since the Archer resignation, to the effect that another prominent Tory was under investigation by the police because of his interest in small boys. And then there's a manuscript asterisk which reads below, this is what I was told, but the press cutting doesn't in fact refer to small boys. Is that your handwriting?
It is.
Had you actually seen the press cutting itself then?
By this stage, I must have done.
Do you have any recollection now what it actually said?
No.
And I don't mean verbatim, but do you remember now what the effect of the story was? If it made no mention to small boys, what was the effect of the article? Do you know?
I can't remember.
As a result, Peter Morrison was being hounded by the press, representatives of which had recently followed him from London to Islay. Morrison had vehemently denied to another friend of mine that there was any truth in the story, and typed in inverted commas is the word hounded. Does that reflect that somebody had passed you this information?
Yes.
And so this was Peter Morrison telling somebody else, and you were passing on this information that, in effect, he was under siege by the press. He'd been followed to the north of the country, but he was denying to yet another friend of yours that there was any truth in the story.
Yes.
And do we understand from the first part of that memorandum that the interest in small boys, that was imparted to you by this other friend?
Yes.
And that had been based on what information, if not from the Daily Star of the 3rd of November? Where had that come from,
I
that
don't
information?
know. I mean, this is all second-hand information,
No.
which I have a responsibility to report to my superiors. I don't know the source of it, and at this date and time I can't remember
No.
which friends told me these things, but what is clear is that these rumours were pretty widespread. at the time.
When the friend told you about the interest in small boys, would it be something you would have quizzed the friend further about, or simply taken on the information, passed it to your superiors and let them investigate, or pass it on to the police as the case may be?
I don't remember what I did.
But what would have been the thing that you would do in that situation? Do you understand the distinction? Would you have simply soaked up the information and passed it down the line, or up the line as the case may be, or would you have actually interrogated the friend for more information?
I could have done either. I could have asked him or her what was the basis of that comment, or I could have just logged it and determined to pass it on.
All right. You passed on the information you've told us because you felt it was your duty to do so. Did you have any insight, one way or the other, whether there was any truth in these rumours?
No, I didn't.
If, as a friend of Morrison's, you felt that these were just ugly rumours and designed for political gain by someone else, or for any other reason, would you nonetheless have passed on the information in the way that you did?
Yes, I would have done.
And you say in your statement you had no view about the allegations effectively one way or the other.
That's true.
May I ask you this? Having passed on this first bit of information, and we see at the top DG with a tick, F to C, F2. Do you understand those hieroglyphics?
I do.
And what do they mean to you?
F is the director in charge of counter-subversion. F2 is the assistant director, all in a different branch to me.
Yeah. Any particular reason why F, and that we see the words to C, is typed in there?
I think the reason this would have gone to F is because of the responsibility to report on security risks to government for that reason. But they weren't my bosses. I was in a different section.
Yeah. Were you ever asked by your bosses for your assessment of the situation, or the truth or otherwise of his denials? Or if
I don't think so.
would you have expected to be?
Not necessarily. I reported what I heard.
Yeah.
It was all hearsay, it was all second-hand, and I trusted those above me to deal with it appropriately.
Let's go then, please, to the next memo that you wrote. It's behind divider tab 6, INQ 004043. And this was 2 days later, with similar indications at the top who was to be included in this memorandum. I saw Peter Morrison and his father last night, so that tends to indicate that must have been on the 12th of November, the day after you'd written the first memo. Unprompted, they told me separately that the press had for the past 2 weeks been camping on Peter's doorstep and seeking his comments. You remember that terminology which we saw in the July 1987 letter.
Indeed.
Peter told me that he had first learned of the allegation 5 years ago, so that would take it back to 1981, when Norman Tebbit had asked him about it. The story, he didn't specify what it was, had been resurrected in the wake of Geoffrey Archer's resignation. The Prime Minister was aware of it and was supporting Peter. Peter hoped the press would publish something so that he could sue and nail the lies that were being spread about him. Was it Peter Morrison then himself who told you that the Prime Minister was aware of it and supporting him?
I think so, yes, it would have been.
And it would certainly have been he who said he hoped the press would publish something so that he could sue and nail the lies. And the memo, therefore, went to Director F, presumably?
Yep.
And DG must have seen it,
Yes.
DG at the time. There are two other annotations on this memorandum. First of all, not your handwriting, I assume?
I know both these handwritings.
Right, good. The first one at the top, apparently also dated the 13th of November, reads, CO informed by telephone, Sir R.A., clearly a reference to Robert Armstrong, has taken no action yet on DG's letter dated the 4th of November. CO, we were told yesterday, Cabinet Office?
Yes.
Whose
But
handwriting?
the handwriting is the Private Secretary of the Director General.
All right. And why would that be written on this internal memorandum?
Because she is, I suggest, telling the Director General this is further, and these other addressees, this is further information. It's been passed in gist to the Cabinet Office, but nothing has so far happened on the earlier letter.
Yeah.
And
So,
sorry.
forgive me, no, carry on, please.
The annotation at the bottom is Anthony Duff, who is asking Director F if he, Director F, agrees that the letter, the subsequent letter that Duff intends to write, subject to the agreement of F, I would write as in the attached draft.
And so the attached draft is, there must have been, is the attached the memo that we're looking at, or is the attachment some draft of a letter that we haven't seen?
It must be a draft of a letter.
And so here, within 2 days, you're passing a second memorandum, which of itself must, to your superiors, have looked as if things were heating up as far as the Morrison rumours and publicity were concerned. At this stage, did anybody sit you down and say, well, Eliza, what's your view about all of this? You're a friend of his. Do you think these allegations might be true?
I don't recall them doing so.
Would you have expected at this stage, within 2 days you're passing memoranda about this man, would you have expected them to have sat you down and say, what's your assessment of all of this? Do you believe these rumours?
The difficulty is that this is the one and only time that I can recall that I reported on a friend of mine, so I didn't know what to expect because I wasn't clear how this would be handled.
Was there any protocol within the service about what should happen in this situation, do you know?
I don't think at that stage there was.
Is there one now? Or at the time you left?
From seeing the evidence of my former colleague yesterday, I realise there's now a well-established policy.
Yeah.
Well before that policy was introduced, and after this period, there would have been a much more determined, a much greater likelihood, both of sources of information being questioned, and that information even if the quality of this information was not known in terms of dates, specificity, likelihood, hearsay, would have been passed to the police, because they would have been in a position to put it into context.
But at that stage, we know that the police were never involved.
I do indeed.
Were you asked, even if your view was, in one sense, valueless, because you were simply the conduit for the information, were you ever asked for the names of the individuals who'd given you the information so that somebody could speak to them to see if they had first-hand information which would be of value to anybody making assessments about Peter Morrison?
I don't think so.
Do you think that
Because if there had been, well, I'm pretty sure not, because it would have been recorded.
Do you think it should have happened?
The difficulty is that there were so many rumours at the time, as you've heard from other witnesses, that I believe the service took a very narrow view and didn't pursue that in any way. Today, and indeed for some years, that would have happened.
Yeah. Well then, let's please, with that in mind, look at the next letter in sequence, tab 7, INQ 004037. 18th of November. Now, this is one of the letters you say you didn't see at the time. We don't see your initials on it, for example. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. Dear Robert, from Anthony Duff. Dear Robert, I wrote to you on the 4th of November about stories about Peter Morrison. Pausing there, other than the annotation from the private secretary, Anthony Duff's private secretary, about Cabinet Office being informed by phone, and Sir Robert Armstrong has taken no action yet in DG's letter of the 4th, rather suggests that there wasn't any other correspondence from the Cabinet Office other than that annotation we saw on your second memorandum.
Yeah.
So back to the letter of the 18th of November. I wrote to you on the 4th about the stories about Peter Morrison. We now hear that the press are following Morrison about, camping on his doorstep in the hope of obtaining some comment from him on the allegations of some years ago. Morrison has said privately that he hopes the press will publish something so that he can sue and nail the stories. He also says that both Mr. Tebbit, who told him of the allegations when they first appeared, and the Prime Minister are aware of the matter. In the circumstances, there'd seem to be little point in carrying this further. And if we just flick over, please, to tab 8 for Sir Robert Armstrong's response of the 17th of December, INQ 004041. My dear Tony, thank you very much for your letter of the 18th of November about Peter Morrison. In the circumstances, I agree. There's little point in carrying the matter further. Now, do you agree that on the face of the material we've seen, within the space of a couple of weeks, Anthony Duff had gone from a position of suggesting that the first step should be to speak to Donald Stewart about the information which had been imparted to him, ideally with the security service remaining in the background, to a position on the 18th of November where, ironically, because of the information that you'd passed to your supervisors on the second occasion in particular, nothing was to be done at all.
It's ironic.
Yeah. Not only is it ironic, but do you agree, if we just look at really the grounds that Anthony Duff employed in order to say, in effect, there's no point doing anything at all, that was based on the information that you passed to the service 5 days before, on the 13th of November?
Yes.
It was that he hoped the press would publish something so that he could sue and nail the stories, and implicitly it appears the suggestion being that if he was liable publicly, that he could sue and therefore prove the stories wrong. But at the same time, and perhaps more importantly for the purposes of this letter, that the Prime Minister was aware of the matter and you had added in your memorandum and supporting him. But that information had come from him.
Yep.
And up to this point in time, we've seen no evidence to suggest that the Prime Minister was supporting him before Sir Anthony
Certainly the
Duff.
Security Service hadn't.
Security Service, indeed.
But I mean, looking at Sir Lord Armstrong's statement, it would appear the Prime Minister was aware already.
It looks
But
very much.
It doesn't look as though the Security Service knew that.
No. And that's why I'm asking you.
Yeah.
Do you think the Security Service should have waited before writing this letter just to check with Sir Robert Armstrong that what Peter Morrison was telling you and which you passed on was in fact accurate, that the Prime Minister was aware and was supporting him, which would have been of importance to the narrow focus that was being taken towards this issue in Peter Morrison's case? Would that have been the better thing to have done rather than to sign off this letter before themselves, knowing if that had been the case?
Yes.
And so in the end, as we see, the matter was never passed to the police. The Security Service itself did nothing based upon the assurances that had come through you that the Prime Minister was aware, as indeed was the case, according to Lord Armstrong, and we'll hear from him shortly, and that was the end of that. Looking back now, do you agree, and certainly you were DG for some time yourself, but do you agree that the police should have been involved, whether there was a safeguarding policy or not?
Yes. Because obviously there should have been. There was a potential crime. There were 2 reports of small boys. And the service wasn't in a position, I wasn't in a position, to judge the validity of this. But as actually subsequently turned out, the police had a lot of information. Our information, my information, the information from Donald Stewart might have been extremely pertinent to their overview of the issue.
But none of it was ever interrogated.
Correct.
Yeah. Final question, I think, from me, please. It's just a small thing, but something that Mrs. Hogg mentioned to us, that after his death in 1995, you didn't attend the funeral. Was there any particular reason for it? Were you unavailable, or is that some insight into your feelings at that time?
It's an insight into my feelings.
Which were?
By the end of the 80s, I think, I had my friendship with Peter Morrison was withering for several reasons. One, I've already mentioned, which I thought he was seeking to give an impression I was his girlfriend, which was inaccurate. Secondly, these allegations, which I didn't know the truth of, but made me feel uncomfortable. And thirdly, I wasn't sure that I liked him much. He had a serious drink problem. He was abusive about his public servants, and I was a public servant, and I therefore tried to avoid seeing him, and I chose not to go to his funeral.
Thank you very much. Would you just give me a moment, please? Lady Manningham-Buller, can I ask you, I'm going to ask the chair and panel to have their break a few minutes earlier now, but I'm going to ask you if you wouldn't mind waiting. There might be just one more question I'm being asked to consider to be asked of you.
Do I stay here?
No, no.
Go away?
I'm going to invite everybody to rise.
Yeah.
You can have a nice cup of coffee, and we'll come back in 15 minutes, and I'll let you know if you're needed or not. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll return at 11:25. Please sit.
Thank you very much. One last question from me. During the period of your service with MI5, did you ever become aware of MI5 having any dealings operationally with or investigation into PI?
No.
Thank you very much. Chair, those are all the questions I seek to ask of Lady Manningham-Buller. Do you have any questions?
Ms Sharpling.
Thank you, Lady Manningham-Buller. Just one question. It's rather broad-based. I wonder if you can help us a little bit with the culture of MI5 at the time that these incidents that we've been talking about occurred. Was there a tendency, if I can put something to you, to make the problem of Peter Morrison go away in some way or other? Perhaps you can describe the culture of the organisation in response to matters of this kind.
I don't think wish to go away is quite a fair interpretation. I think rather that the organisation then interpreted its role on security in a very narrow way, and therefore it's clear it wasn't alert to, at the very least, the implications of the references to young children. And I think in that it was possibly not out of sync with some of the wider cultural attitudes of the time, but certainly that would have changed dramatically during the period that I served.
Thank you. Thank you. We have no further questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming. Sit down.
Would you please repeat after me? I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Would you give us your name, please?
My name is Robert Temple Armstrong, Lord Armstrong of Westminster.
Lord Armstrong, can we turn immediately to the witness statement you gave the inquiry? It's in your file behind tab 1, and I'm going to adduce it into evidence. It's INQ 004057, because I'm going to use that as the template, as it were, for your evidence, because I think it'll be easier that way. And I'll direct you to the paragraph numbers, and from time to time we'll look at documents, but you'll be able to stick with the statements. If you wish to look, you'll see documents on the screen to your right-hand side. First of all, can you confirm, please, that you were Secretary to the Cabinet from October 1979 to December 1987?
I can.
Which meant that you were the Prime Minister's principal advisor on intelligence and security matters. Is that correct?
That's right.
And do you say in your statement in paragraph 2 that each of these security and intelligence agencies reported to a departmental cabinet minister, the Security Service MI5 to the Home Secretary, the Secret Intelligence Service MI6, and Government Communications Headquarters GCHQ to the Foreign and Commonwealth Secretary?
I do.
And was your main function in relation to the security and intelligence services to advise ministers on the annual estimate for the secret vote, which provided funds for all three services? Is that correct?
That is correct.
And for that purpose, I think you had the advice of a committee on which the Treasury, the two departments and the three services were all represented.
That's right.
Were you also advised or consulted, and I'm looking at your paragraph 3, when issues arose which needed or might need to be reported to the Prime Minister because they were likely to raise issues of policy which ought to be drawn to the Prime Minister's attention, or indeed matters which you say could give rise to political embarrassment if they became matters of public knowledge?
Yes, that's right.
And did that latter include allegations of misconduct by ministers who were not subject to the process of positive vetting if they were in positions where they had access to security-sensitive information?
That is correct.
So with that by way of background, can we please begin with your knowledge of matters in relation to Peter Morrison? First of all, at paragraph 4, you say you met him on a few occasions, but you didn't know him well. Were you aware that he was believed to be homosexual?
I was aware that some people said he was, certainly, yes.
Yeah.
Or said they thought he was.
But, of course, at the time you're dealing with, it wasn't, of course, a criminal offence any longer, and therefore, as you say, no action was called for by you. Is that right?
That's right.
You recalled him being a junior member of government for a short period, but you felt it unlikely that he would have had any access to security-sensitive classified material. Is that right?
In the departments in which he served, it was not likely that he would have access to that sort of material.
Yeah.
He might have had access to material which was commercially confidential,
Yeah.
but that's different.
Yes. Now, November 1983 is where you pick up the time period, because you remember being told by John Wakeham, who was then the government chief whip, that rumours were circulating to the effect that Morrison had been picked up by the police for importuning but hadn't been charged. And is that drawn from a recollection that you have of what you were told and when you were told?
I think I recorded that I've been told it, but yes.
You add that it was clear that the police and the prosecution authorities were aware of the matter. And is that a question of deduction by reason of the fact that he'd been picked up by the police?
Yes.
So simply because...
If the rumours were true,
absolutely.
The police knew all about it.
Yeah. So that was the understanding that you had. And did you say that you assumed that the Prime Minister had also been told by the Chief Whip? But you say to make sure you raised the issue with the Prime Minister at one of your regular meetings with her.
Yes.
And when you did, and we're still talking about November 1983 as I understand you, when you did, what did you find out from her?
Well, I found that she was already aware of the rumours, and we agreed that they were no more than rumours, and that if a criminal offence had been committed, the police and the prosecution authorities were aware of it, and it was consequently their responsibility to deal with it.
Did she tell you, the Prime Minister, where she had heard the rumours, if not from you? Did you understand from her where they had come from?
I presume they'd come from the Conservative Party, the chief whip, or one of the officers in the Conservative Party organisation.
Accordingly, at that time, did you tell her that you would make sure that the security service was aware of the matter?
I did.
But you say you did in a meeting with the then Director General, Sir John Jones.
Yes, Sir John Jones, yes.
Yeah. Now, can we look at a letter that you have yourself been asked to look at. I think it would probably be easier for you, Lord Armstrong, if you stay with the statements, and I'm going to put this document on the screen so that you're not flicking backwards and forwards. But for the chair and the panel, it's divider 2 of your file, and I'll put it up on screen. Now, Lord Armstrong, you stay with the statements. I think you'll find it easier. CAB 000126. You've seen this letter before. You've been asked to comment on it. And you may have been in the hearing room, I think you were, when I asked Lady Manningham-Buller about this letter dated the 6th of January, 1986. And this information relates to rumours that had been circulating to the effect that Peter Morrison had been picked up by the police for importuning, and it relates to November 1983. So this appears to be the same information that you had received from John Wakeham, who was the Chief Whip, which you passed on to the Prime Minister at that time. Is that right?
Same or very similar.
Yeah. Because this is a letter that is being written to you by Sir Anthony Duff, who was the DG, the Director General of the service at the time. Was it a normal part of the Director General's role to keep the Cabinet Secretary informed of this kind of information?
Yes, it didn't. You talk about normal. It didn't happen very often.
No. But what would the point be in the Director General making you aware of this information? Was it to pass it on to the Prime Minister?
It was to make sure that the Prime Minister knew about it.
And was that in order to prevent potential embarrassment, the kind of embarrassment you spoke about earlier in your statement?
It was so that she shouldn't be taken by surprise
Yeah.
if there were developments, public developments.
Was it also a question of security, or was it simply a focus on the Prime Minister not being taken by surprise? Was it something that you had to be aware of, possible security implications?
Certainly so, but it didn't seem that there were security implications in this case.
And that's because?
Because he was not in departments which had access to that security-sensitive information.
I understand. Now, your paragraph 7 of your witness statement, please, Lord Armstrong. If you go back to that behind tab 1. It's on the second page. INQ 004057.
Sorry, I've got number 1.
No. You'll see a 1
Oh, yes.
just behind the A, and it should be sandwiched in between those.
Yeah.
So if you go, please, to the second page, you'll find paragraph 7. And in relation to the letter that we have been looking at, you say, I told the Prime Minister about the letter from Sir Anthony Duff to make sure that she was aware of the potential problem. She said that she was aware of the continuing rumours, agreed that there was nothing that could be done at present, but asked to be kept in touch with any developments. When the Prime Minister says that there is nothing that can be done, what did that mean to you?
Well, it means to me that she has thought about it and that she does not see that anything needs to be done at the moment.
What kind of action, if she had considered something ought to be done, what kind of action would have been likely in those days if the Prime Minister had suggested it?
I think she would have wanted the security service to make further inquiries about the rumours they'd heard.
Would informing the police have been something that she might have suggested ought to happen?
She didn't suggest that.
No. And on this occasion, I suppose that might not have been suggested because the information was, if it was accurate, that he'd been picked up by the police. So
Yes,
on the face of it, they were already aware if the rumour was true.
that's true.
Let's then look, please, at another letter with which you're familiar. It's CAB 000125, and it may be easier for you, Lord Armstrong, if you look at the screen to your right. It's in your file, but I think you might find it easier to keep your statement open, but have a look at the document. Are you able to read that? Or,
Yeah.
Or would you prefer to read it in
I
hard
prefer
copy?
to read it in the script.
All right, it's tab 4.
Yeah. Tab 4.
Tab 4, please, yeah.
Yeah.
You were asked to consider this letter of the 4th of November, addressed to you from Sir Anthony Duff. And so it's several months on from the letter we just looked at of the 6th of January, this time the 4th of November. And it says, Dear Robert, do we see your initials and perhaps a tick entered over your name?
It was my initials, yes.
Would that signify you'd read the letter?
Yes.
And you refer to the letter from the service with their reference of the 13th of January. That was a response to the letter of the 6th of January. We don't need to look at it now. We looked at it with Lady Manningham Buller. Stories about him persist. The member of my staff was told last month by Donald Stewart, the Conservative Party agent for Westminster, that he heard from two sources that Morrison has a penchant for small boys. And we see a little further, he gave the impression of having received the information recently, but this might simply reflect the fact that Morrison has only recently taken up his position in the Conservative Central Office and has therefore only recently come into Stewart's orbit. And the information could be old. And then says Sir Anthony to you, the position is therefore that we are still not clear whether the stories about Morrison are a reflection of the 1983 rumour, and we've seen reference to that already, or are based on something more recent. It does seem rather important to seek to resolve the matter one way or another if possible. There must, I suppose, be a real possibility that Morrison will be a candidate for office again at some stage, and we should then be confronted by the need to consider these stories in the security context. It would be preferable, if possible, to dispose of them or confirm them before then. The first step would be to talk to Stewart, and then over the page. At the present stage, however, and especially in the light of the Geoffrey Archer case, the risk of political embarrassment to the government is rather greater than security danger. I wonder if, as a first step, the Chief Whip might think it appropriate to question Stewart. The security service could do this if necessary, and we do have the impression that Stewart meant his information to reach our ears, but I would just as soon that we didn't get directly involved for the time being. Now, in the material, Lord Armstrong, do you agree that there is nothing to suggest that you responded to that letter in writing?
I think not. I would have mentioned it to the Prime Minister, but
so
that would have been done at an oral meeting.
Yeah. And so you would have mentioned the content of this development, and you say that in paragraph 9 of your statement. I reported this development orally to the Prime Minister. You said, as you've told us already, that she was clearly already aware from other sources of the current rumours about his activities and his propensities. And you say it was the Prime Minister who didn't think it necessary to ask the Government Chief Whip to interview Mr. Stewart. So the position we have in the 4th of November letter is Sir Anthony Duff is suggesting that the first step is to speak to Stewart, And ideally it's the Chief Whip who should be doing it rather than security service who wish to remain in the background. And in your paragraph 9 of the witness statement that you've made, do we understand then it was the Prime Minister herself who thought that that was unnecessary? In other words, asking the Chief Whip to speak to Donald Stewart was unnecessary?
Well, it was the Prime Minister who said this to me.
Yeah. And did she explain why she thought that that was unnecessary?
No.
Did you understand from anything that she said or infer from anything she said to you why it was unnecessary?
I presume that she had made inquiries through party channels.
Did you think it was the right decision?
I did, because he was going to be deputy chairman of the Conservative Party, and I thought that that was where the action should lie.
Yeah. Did the fact that he was also deputy chairman of the Conservative Party, did that, given the focus, the narrow focus of this was security as well as potential embarrassment, did that reduce the risk insofar as security was concerned because he wasn't a government minister?
Yes.
Had he been a government minister, do you think a different action might have been taken?
I think it would have depended in what department he was going to be a minister.
So if it was a security-sensitive department...
If it was the Ministry of Defence or the Foreign Office or something like that, then yes, it would have been a serious matter to think about that.
But if energy or trade and industry...
If it's employment
yeah.
or trade, not so.
Right. In the final paragraph of Sir Anthony Duff's letter on the second page of the 4th of November letter, the risk of political embarrassment to the government is rather greater than the security danger. Was that anything that you discussed with the Prime Minister when you spoke to her about the development that was manifest in this letter?
I can't really remember.
Is it likely?
I can't really remember.
Is it likely?
Is what likely?
Is it likely that you would have raised with the Prime Minister the risk of political embarrassment?
It was to be sure that she was aware of that I spoke to her.
Yeah. Now, you have looked at a letter dated the 18th of November, but before we come to it, can we just look at a couple of memoranda which I doubt you would have known about at the time, but you've been asked to look at. And the first is behind your tab 6, INQ 004036. And this was the first of the two memoranda that Eliza Manningham-Buller wrote internally to inform her superiors that there were rumours, further rumours about Peter Morrison, in particular on the 11th of November, that he was being hounded by the press, but that he had vehemently denied to another person, a friend of hers, that there was any truth in the story. But the first friend had told her of his interest in small boys. Do you see that in the centre of this memorandum?
Yeah.
Although in handwriting at the bottom, part of the information had come from the Star newspaper. The press cutting she saw, as she told us earlier, did not refer to small boys, but clearly some of the information she was receiving and passed on suggested precisely that small boys were involved. And you had seen for yourself in the 4th of November letter that part of the information was he had a penchant for small boys. Do you remember that?
Yes. I see that in the letter.
Yeah. When you told the Prime Minister about that, did not the fact that it wasn't simply a question that he was homosexual, but the rumours were that he had a penchant for small boys, did that not change the complexion of the seriousness of what the government might be dealing with?
Well, clearly it did. But clearly also the Conservative Party had this information.
And so are you saying by implication that it was for them to deal with?
Yes.
So if anybody was to deal with it, any institution was to deal with it, it was the Conservative Party who were in government at the time. And what might they have done with it, the information?
They could have asked the police to investigate it.
But we know nobody ever did. Did you ever regard it as your position as Cabinet Secretary either to advise the Prime Minister that that is the course that ought to have been adopted?
No, as it was coming from the party organisation, I assumed that she would be getting the advice she needed on the matter from them.
But you didn't regard it as part of your obligation to advise her robustly, if needs be, that the Prime Minister ought to ensure that the information was passed on, in particular that he had a penchant for small boys?
I didn't think it was my duty to advise her about that, given that she had told me that she was aware of these things.
Sorry. Let's go to the next memorandum, again which you won't have seen at the time. Behind tab 7, please. And you'll remember that, and I think you agree, that no response has been recovered to the 4th of November letter. But what we see in handwriting at the top of the document in tab 7, which is INQ 004043, is Cabinet Office informed by telephone Sir Robert Armstrong, Sir RA, has taken no action yet in DG's letter dated the 4th of November. You've told us that you informed the Prime Minister and she was aware of the continuing rumours. And granted that this is not your note, it's Sir Anthony Duff's private secretary, I think we were told. What to you does the words Sir Robert Armstrong has taken no action yet on DG's letter mean? What does that mean to you?
I think it means to me that Sir Anthony Duff had not had a reply from me to his letter of 4th November.
So simply that, it didn't mean, or it doesn't mean to you, has
well,
taken...
I haven't seen it until now.
No, I accept that. Or that you've seen the documents. But what I'm asking you is, Robert Armstrong has taken no action yet on the letter. You think that means that you've simply not responded to it rather than taken, as it were, substantive action about the content of the letter?
Well, I think they would have been told that I had spoken to the Prime Minister.
And we see what the information is within the body of this internal memorandum. It includes that Morrison had actually spoken to Eliza Manningham-Buller and had told him, among other things, that the Prime Minister was aware of the information and was supporting Peter. Now, pausing there, Lord Armstrong, your evidence is that she was aware of the rumours, so that's consistent with what you're telling us.
Yes.
And was supporting Peter. If he told Eliza Manningham-Buller that she was supporting him, the Prime Minister was supporting him, is that consistent with anything Margaret Thatcher said to you at the time?
I'm sorry, could you say that question again?
The memorandum says it is informing MI5 superiors that the Prime Minister was aware of the information of the rumours and that she was supporting Peter Morrison. And this is what Peter Morrison had said directly to Eliza Manningham-Buller. And my question is, from anything that Margaret Thatcher said to you in the meetings that you had at the time, was she in fact not only aware but also supporting him?
I don't remember any words that suggested that she was supporting him. explicitly, but I took it from the fact that she didn't appear to want me to take any further action, that she was being fully informed by the party.
And so that we understand, please, at any time when you were discussing with her the continuing rumours and the developments during this period, was ever any suggestion ever made that the police should be involved over and above what the first rumours suggested of previous involvement with him? Was there any suggestion made by the Prime Minister or you to the Prime Minister that it was time to bring the police in?
I don't remember any such suggestion.
Do you think that ought to have happened?
I think it was up to the Conservative Party to consider whether they took the rumours sufficiently seriously to report them to the police.
If we move on, please, to the next letter at your tab 8, CAB 000122. This was, I call it a decision letter, but it's dated the 18th of November. It's to you from Anthony Duff. Again, it appears that your initials, this is the letter received by the Cabinet Office, or by you at the time, with your initials and a tick over your name, indicating, as you said to us before, that you had received the letter. I wrote to you on the 4th of November about the stories about Peter Morrison. We now hear that the press are following Morrison about, camping on his doorstep in the hope of obtaining some comment from him on the allegations of some years ago. Morrison has said privately that he hopes the press will publish something so that he can sue and nail the stories. He also says that both Mr. Tebbit, who told him of the allegations when they first appeared, and the Prime Minister are aware of the matter. In the circumstances, there seem to be little point in carrying this further. You'll note, Lord Armstrong, and of course it's not your letter, you were in receipt of it, that the information that's passed on is the Prime Minister was aware of the matter, but there's nothing about supporting him. But this is the decision that Sir Anthony Duff made, and as we saw this morning, it's based almost entirely on the second bits of information that Eliza Manningham-Buller passed on to her superiors on the 13th of November, 5 days before this letter was written. And your response, if you kindly go behind tab 10, INQ 004041 of the 17th of December. Thank you very much for your letter of the 18th about Peter Morrison. In the circumstances, I agree, there's little point in carrying the matter further. What was it about Sir Anthony Duff's letter to you of the month before, the 18th of November letter, CAB 000122, that made you agree with Anthony Duff that the circumstances were such that there was little point to doing anything about it?
I think we come back to the point that the Conservative Party were fully aware of the matter, not just the Prime Minister, but Mr. Tebbit, who was the chairman of the party at the time, and it was for them to consider what action they should take in relation to somebody who was or was about to become deputy chairman of the Conservative Party. There was clearly no security concern.
No. In your paragraph 11, in your statement, page 3 at the top, you say this: it suggested that the information that Mr. Morrison was prepared to sue, if anything was published in the press, may have reached the Director General from a security service officer who was a friend of Mr. Morrison. And we know that that was Eliza Manningham-Buller. If this is true, I see nothing inappropriate in it. I think that the officer concerned would have been failing in his duty if he had not reported it, and she has told us that it was her duty. It would have been for the Director General and his senior colleagues to consider whether the officer concerned had been put up to transmit this information and how far to discount it if they thought he had been. So, were you saying there, Lord Armstrong, that you felt it was a decision for the Director General to make and the senior officers of MI5 at that time, whether they made an assessment of the information received by the member of staff, in this instance Eliza Manningham-Buller, and the extent to which she might have been used by Peter Morrison to put up false information?
Yes, I didn't know who the officer was.
No.
Or the relationship with...
No, but the point is, were you saying that that was a matter for the Director General of MI5? In other words, whether they should simply have taken the information that was being passed on trust, for example, Peter Morrison's vehement denials, or whether the service should have inquired a little more closely into the validity of the information that was being passed?
No, I didn't think that the security service should have been inquiring more closely.
No? So can we just understand then, please, in your paragraph 11, why did you say it would have been for the Director General and his senior colleagues to consider whether the officer concerned had been put up to transmit this information and how far to discount it if they thought he had been? I'm simply asking you about that sentence, really. Why did you put that in your statement?
Well, because I thought that the Director General had information which he'd been given by a member of his staff, and it was up to him to assess it.
All right. Are you making any judgment about whether or not that information ought to have been assessed?
No.
In paragraph 12 of your statement, you say, I don't know whether the security service reported Donald Stewart's information to the police or conducted any further inquiries. If they didn't do so, then I don't know why they didn't. And so the situation appears, because we know they didn't, that the security service didn't report it to the police, the Cabinet Office didn't report it to the police, the Prime Minister didn't report it to the police, nor did the Conservative Party. And looking back, Lord Armstrong, do you think that was correct at the time?
I thought that was correct at the time. I thought that the police had been aware of the police. We knew from November what the Chief Whip had said in November 1983, that the police were aware of the affairs then. And that they would presumably be following up that information if they needed to do so.
You say in your paragraph 13, my view was that Mr. Stewart's story appeared to have been second-hand and very unspecific, and there were no security implications. The police already knew about Mr. Morrison's activities and propensities, and therefore it was their role to investigate Mr. Morrison and to take matters any further. And if anyone should have contacted the police about Stewart's story, it should have been Mr. Stewart or the Conservative Party. Of course, you all agree, Lord Armstrong, that one could only say that the police already knew about Morrison and his activities and propensities if the information that he'd been picked up for importuning was accurate. Otherwise, there was a risk that the police knew absolutely nothing about it.
I should have said alleged activities, yes.
Yeah. But you understand my point. There was a risk that the police knew nothing about Morrison, who was in a position of power, whichever way one looks at it, and yet nothing was done by anyone.
Well, presumably, I don't know this, presumably the Conservative Party must have satisfied themselves that Peter Morrison's denials were true.
You'll agree.
The fact that they had done so appeared from subsequent events.
By which you mean?
By which I mean that in 1989 or sometime like that, the Prime Minister appointed Sir Peter Morrison to be her parliamentary private secretary. So she wouldn't have appointed somebody to a position of that sort if she'd had any doubts about the matter.
And from your knowledge, having been Cabinet Secretary around that period, what process did Peter Morrison have to go through in order to be appointed the Prime Minister's PPS?
I haven't the faintest idea. And I had retired when it happened.
Well, what about in your time? If the Prime Minister was looking to appoint a PPS, what process would that person have gone through?
Well, it was not a government appointment.
No, I appreciate that, but I'm asking you from your own knowledge, what process would a person appointed by the Prime Minister as PPS have to go through in those days?
I don't know.
Would it involve vetting of any kind?
I don't know.
Police or security checks?
I don't know.
Interview?
I don't know.
You will agree, I'm sure, that between the 4th of November, when Sir Anthony Duff was recommending Donald Stewart being spoken to by the Chief Whip and the Security Service remaining in the background, and the 18th of November, when he was writing to you, saying there would seem to be little point in carrying this further, that in the space of 2 weeks, from suggesting that something had to be done to him suggesting that nothing ought to be done and you agreeing with it, was a very short period of time indeed. Do you accept that?
Well, it was 14 days, yes.
Yeah. To the suggestion that this was all just a cover-up of Peter Morrison and his activities by the political establishment in particular, what would you say?
Well, I should have said that I was certainly not aware of any cover-up, and that Peter Morrison had emphatically denied the truth of any of this stuff, and had said that he would sue if any publication was made.
But that was to accept Peter Morrison's word and take it on trust, wasn't it?
That appears to be what the Conservative Party did.
If, looking at matters another way, Lord Armstrong, if the allegations were true, not merely that he had a penchant for small boys, but that he was putting into practice his sexual preferences, there were children who were at risk. Do you agree?
If that were so, it would be true.
And there were children at risk, but the security service was concerned about the risk to security that Peter Morrison presented, and the Conservative Party and the Prime Minister were simply worried about the potential for political embarrassment. But nobody seemed to think about the kids.
Well, kids didn't come into it till the reference to the penchant for small boys,
Yeah, but
by Donald Stewart. And Donald Stewart presumably reported that within the Conservative Party of which he was an employee.
or you would hope he did.
Sorry?
Or you would hope he did.
Well, I would be very surprised if he did not.
Although the interesting feature, of course, of the 4th of November letter is Sir Anthony Duff thinks that the information was passed by Donald Stewart to go to the ears of the security service. So is it likely that Donald Stewart might not have mentioned it to anybody within the Conservative Party, but decided to ensure that the information came to the ears of the security service in order that it could be investigated by MI5?
I really can't comment on that. As he was employed by the Conservative Party, I would have assumed that he had told the Conservative Party of these things.
Now, right at the back of this bundle, Lord Armstrong, and it's something I'm sure you're aware, there's a Mail Online article. It's behind tab 21.
Yeah.
I INQ 004073. And can I ask you please to go to the 5th page? You'll see in the bottom right-hand corner with the inquiry reference the digits 005, and that's the page
Yeah.
I'd like you to go to if you would.
Yes, page 5.
Page 5, please.
Page 5. Yes, 005.
That's it.
Yeah.
And do you see, this is an article that the Daily Mail wrote in relation to these events, or at least some of them, on the 24th of July 2015. And there is a quotation attributed to you. Lord Armstrong told the Daily Mail, quote, "I thought MI5's actions were correct at the time. I think they were right to report the rumour. They were right to make what inquiries they could, and they were right to come to the conclusion they did. I think if there was evidence, it would have been properly examined at the time. I don't think this is a matter of important people being protected. You can't pursue inquiries unless you have evidence on which you can base the inquiry. A shadow of a rumour is not enough." Now, did you agree those were your words to the Daily Mail at the time that this article was written?
I've forgotten, I'm afraid.
No. Are the words "a shadow of a rumour" the kind of words that you might have used?
I might have done.
Yeah. And if you'd said them, do you think that's a fair assessment, that this was nothing more than a shadow of a rumour about Peter Morrison?
Well, as it reached me, it was not more than that.
Can we have a look at the next sentence, please, in the article? Lord Armstrong said he knew the identity of the MP in question, but refused to name him, saying, quote, "I think he was interviewed, but he denied it. It's not my position to name him," unquote. Now, do you think you told them that as well?
I have forgotten, but
And the reason I ask is, if you said this, Lord Armstrong, I'd just like to understand what was the interview in which he denied it that you're talking about. Because I don't think we know of any interview with Peter Morrison in which he denied, or for that matter, said anything.
well, I think I thought he must have been interviewed by somebody in the party.
So that's, if you said that, that's what you think you're talking about there.
And he had obviously talked to Mrs. Tebbit.
So you think that might be a discussion he had with Norman Tebbit, who was, the chair of the party at the time?
Yes. Mm. Well, we know he said that he had talked to Mr. Tebbit.
Yeah. Well, while I'm thinking about him, I'm sure you'll be aware that Norman Tebbit, Lord Tebbit as he was and is, in July 2014 went on the Andrew Marr show and talked about things being covered up in those days. Were you aware of that television programme, Lord Armstrong?
I don't remember it.
Perhaps we can just play it to see if it brings it home. It's INQ 004091.
Simon Danchuk's piece in the Mail on Sunday, which I quoted at the beginning of the programme.
What I find we have to do is to remember the atmosphere of the times. It's very easy to forget that things looked different in those days.
Geoffrey Dickens was widely attacked as a kind of buffoon for raising this at the time.
Yes, indeed. He was widely regarded as a chap who was always falling over his own feet. Also, at that time, I think most people would have thought that the establishment, the system, was to be protected. And if a few things had gone wrong here and there, that it was more important to protect the system than to delve too far into them. Now that view, I think, was wrong then, and it is spectacularly shown to have been wrong because the abuses have grown.
Do you think there was a big political cover-up at the time, back 30 years ago?
I think there may well have been, but it was almost unconscious. It was the thing that people did at that time.
You didn't talk about these guys?
You didn't talk about those sort of things. It's not the sort of thing that people did, not even, if I may say so, television journalists, let alone the politicians.
Would have raised it.
Now, have you seen that before, Lord Armstrong?
I've read about it, I think. I don't think I've seen it.
All right. Now, if we can get our bearings right, Peter Morrison was the deputy chair of the Conservative Party between September 1986 and June 1987, so it covered the period that we're looking at. And again, there was reference to that in one of the letters, that he was in central office. Norman Tebbit was the chairman of the Conservative Party the year before he started, September 1985, and he also was chair until June 1987. So it looks very much as if Norman Tebbit and Peter Morrison were in central office, chair and deputy chair, at the very same time.
I think they were, yes.
Yeah. And so, if anyone would know about a cover-up, Norman Tebbit would likely know about that.
I can't say what Norman Tebbit did or did not know. I was not aware of any cover-up myself.
Right, can we look at something else, please, Lord Armstrong? Because I'd like to come on to Peter Hayman, so an entirely different topic. And if you'd kindly go, please, to tab 14. And in your statement, if you're looking for a reference, let me help you. Your statement begins, also paragraph 14. Now, the document we have...
I'm getting confused because 14 in my thing is a tiny little bit of paper.
That's it. No, that's the right thing. That's
this minute was agreed with Sir Brian Cubbon.
That's a cover sheet, but if you look behind, you'll see a minute which was written by you to the Prime Minister
on
the 27th of October. Well, we'll put that up on the screen. HOM002203. So if we go, please, to the next page. Well, in fact, can we go a couple of pages on to, because we can see where this all begins, to page 6. If you have a look, you'll see a 006 in the bottom of the right-hand corner, which is the next page after the end of your minute to the Prime Minister. In the same tab.
Yeah.
Same tab.
Sorry.
It's all right, take your time. There we are.
Oh, yes, there we are.
I assume you remember this, or have some memory of it.
Yes, I have some memory of that.
Not every day a British High Commissioner is referred to as the Beast of Berlin. The date of this Private Eye article, although not on the article itself, is the 24th of October 1980, so we're going back in time. And it reads, having only just recovered from the Anthony Blunt scandal, Britain's battered security forces have recently been given evidence of yet another highly placed potential security risk. The man in question is Sir Peter Hayman, who ended a distinguished career as British High Commissioner in Canada from 1970 to 74. Previously, Hayman held a series of highly delicate posts, including Assistant Principal to the Ministry of Home Secretary, Personal Assistant to the Chief Staff Officer to the Minister of Defence, member of the UK's delegation to NATO, Director General of British Information Services, New York, and perhaps most crucially, Minister and Deputy Commandant in the British military government of West Berlin. Such a combination of defence and Foreign Office postings almost invariably indicates an intelligence background. Sir Peter would certainly have had access to top-secret papers. The risk to security lay in the fact that during at least some of his career, Hayman was a sexual deviant who kept explicit and detailed diaries cataloguing years of his sexual activities, which involved every conceivable perversion. Much of what he recorded was fantasy, but some of the events clearly had occurred. The diaries, along with articles of female clothing and pornographic photos, were found in a sparsely furnished flat at 95 Linden Gardens, Notting Hill, by Pawn Squad officers who raided the flat in the summer of 1978. The police raid followed the discovery of a bulky package of obscene material addressed to a Mr. Henderson on a bus. Police also discovered that Henderson, who was in fact Hayman, was a member of the paedophile information exchange and frequently entertained prostitutes at his Linden Gardens flat. Hayman appears to have used Pi in order to locate other deviants for correspondence purposes, also using contact magazines for the same end. Hayman's role emerged after 2 men were conditionally discharged for 3 years after pleading guilty to sending obscene material through the post. The decision not to prosecute Hayman, who was certainly as guilty as these 2 unfortunates, came from high up, much to the disgust of the DPP, Tony Hetherington's aides, and also the policemen involved in the case. They were told that this was no reflection on the evidence, and indeed at one stage Hayman appears to have been cautioned. He was also warned not to send obscene material through the post again. The diaries, some 46-something sized books of 80 pages each, clearly refer to Hayman's period of office in Canada. What MI5 and MI6 are deeply worried about is how much further back did Hayman's activities extend, and how public did he make them. Yet again, the much vaunted system of positive vetting appears to have broken down completely. Now, does that bring that all back a little?
Yes.
In your statement, Lord Armstrong, at paragraph 16, you say that neither the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, which was Peter Hayman's parent department, nor the Cabinet Office, nor for that matter the Security Service, knew anything about any of the matters sent out in that article until it was published. Is that right?
Correct.
That's how you remember things. And as a result of that article, if we go back, please, to tab 14, and we'll put it, should keep that on screen, please, but go to page 2 of it. Same document, page 2.
This is not the
This is your minute
this is
behind
my
tab
minute,
14.
not
Yeah.
the email article.
No, just the second page of that, please.
Yeah.
That document is all part of one document because the article was an attachment to the minute. This is a minute written by you to the Prime Minister, and it's dated just a few days after the date of the article, three days, in fact, the 27th of October 1980. And let's just read through it together if we can, please. Your attention has been drawn to the article, of which I attach a copy, in last week's Private Eye, containing allegations about the sexual activities and proclivities of Sir Peter Hayman, a retired member of the diplomatic service. I attach a copy of Sir Peter Hayman's entry in Who's Who, and in fact that is attached at the back. We don't need to look at it. It's not the case that he had, quote, had an intelligence background, unquote, which is in his Who's Who entry, I think, but throughout his career, and especially as Minister in West Berlin from 1964 to 66, Foreign Office 66 to 69, High Commissioner in Ottawa from 1970 to 74, he had access to highly confidential and sensitive material. He's been, to all appearances, a healthy, normal and happily married man. Now, Lord Armstrong, this is something you wrote, or was it something that was written for you and submitted by you to the Prime Minister?
Well, it was submitted by me to the Prime Minister. I don't remember how it came to be made. I remember the memorandum, I remember discussing it with, or a draft of it, with other people.
Yeah. But is it likely that you would have been assisted in writing this?
I should have
memorandum?
certainly
Yeah.
been assisted, yes.
Paragraph 3 came to the notice of the DPP, Director of Public Prosecutions, in 1978, very much as described in the article, on the basis of a police report as a result of a parcel of obscene material discovered in a bus and of subsequent investigations. The police report showed that Sir Peter Hayman kept explicit and detailed recordings of his sexual activities and fantasies, and that he was a member of the Paedophile Information Exchange. But the only activities which could be shown to have occurred were with consenting adults of both sexes. The material in the records relating to children appeared all to be fantasy, and there was and is no evidence for actual activities with children. The only offence for which he could have been charged was that of sending obscene material through the post, and I'm advised that it was and is the policy of the Director of Public Prosecutions not to prosecute for this offence, except if there has been a complaint from the recipient or the object of committing the offence was commercial gain. And then the note deals with the contents of the police reports, which are confidential, and the general rule must be that information contained in them is not transmitted to anyone outside the prosecution process unless a case is brought and ends in conviction. Nonetheless, if a police report to the director suggested to him that there were matters relating to a serving public servant which had implications for security, he'd consider alerting the security authorities to the need to make their own inquiries. This didn't happen in this instance because at the time, when the director was considering the possibility of prosecution, Sir Peter Hayman was no longer serving. He'd been in retirement for 4 years. It's clear that Sir Peter Hayman was already engaging in sexual perversion in 1966 when he returned from Berlin to the Foreign Office. And it must be presumed that he was doing so before that time. He'd, of course, have been especially vulnerable in Berlin. While Sir Peter Hayman was High Commissioner in Ottawa, there was a problem of obscene correspondence addressed to a fictitious female name at the High Commission, apparently as a result of advertisements placed in a pornographic magazine. At the time, this was laid at the door of a member of the domestic staff. The latest report raises the question whether it should have been laid at Sir Peter's door. Peter Hayman's been in touch with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. He's offered to come in, was to be seen by the acting head of office, Sir Edward Yude. Have I mispronounced it or pronounced it correctly? Is it Yude or Yaud?
Yude.
Yude, thank you. But he has now been advised by his solicitor, Sir David Napley, that he shouldn't call at the Foreign Office unless and until he's told that they have something to discuss with him. We're not yet ready for a discussion. At this stage, we could do no more than listen to what he had to say. And then 2 questions are posed. What to do and what to say. If questions are asked, I've discussed these questions with the acting head of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, Permanent Under Secretary of State at the Home Office, Director of Public Prosecutions, and the Director General of the Security Service. And the what to do, you advise a full investigation with a view to discovering whether anything more is known or suspected about his activities while serving in the diplomatic service, and whether there is any reason to suppose that the security was compromised. Investigation is being undertaken by the security services, and then whether any further action is required, in this case a review of vetting procedures, which is what that part of the note continues to say. And then if we flip over the page, please, under the heading What to Say, and this is advice to the Prime Minister. If you're asked questions in the House tomorrow, you'll need to be cautious in your replies. In particular, you will need not to say that the article is true, if only because at this stage you can't exclude the possibility, however unlikely, of libel proceedings. And you point out he's not been prosecuted, but questions about whether he should have been prosecuted and why he wasn't are for the Attorney General as the senior law officer of the Crown, not as a member of the government, and all questions should be referred to him. And so that's the nature of the note. I'm going to simply point out that at the foot of the last page, in paragraph 14, you say that you're sending copies of this minute and of the annexes to the Home Secretary, the Foreign and Commonwealth Secretary, the Lord President, in view of the vetting procedures implications, and the Attorney. And therefore, rightly so, by the look of it, this was all taken pretty seriously.
It certainly was.
We saw, Lord Armstrong, and I'm looking at your paragraph 17, if you want to keep a finger in that document, because we will come back to it later, perhaps not yet. But paragraph 17 of your witness statement, by reference to the Private Eye article, which suggested that the Director of Public Prosecutions, the DPP, had been minded to authorise a prosecution, but had been overruled by a higher authority. Did you know that, whether that was right or wrong?
I thought that I was sure that I know that it was wrong. That the Director of Public Prosecutions' advice was to the Attorney not to prosecute, and the Attorney General accepted it.
I said keep a finger in that document. I meant it at the time, but I don't mean it any longer. Can we go, please, to a document behind tab 12, CAB 000071, and I'm going to ask you to go to page 24 of that. Page 24. This is a file of material found at the Cabinet Office relating to the Hayman case, dated from the 28th of October 1980 to the 18th of March 1981. Do you have page 24? If you look in the bottom corner, you're looking for 024.
I've got 001 at the moment.
Then you need to
So
flick on
that's
23.
document 12. What am I looking at?
No, you're in the right document. Just go to the 24th page of it, please.
The pages on 24.
It should have a double, a 0.
Yes, I see where you mean.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You got that? And you'll see at the top comments by the DPP on the Private Eye article, Beast of Berlin, of the 2nd of January. So clearly that there was a further article that was written, and this was Beast of Berlin number 2, and we can see the date of this note, these comments by Sir Thomas. He's referred to as Tony, I think, in the article, but it was Sir Thomas Hetherington, by now the 7th of January. And if we see what he had to say in the first paragraph, the Director is not aware of any disagreement between the Attorney and himself on these matters. Second, the Attorney has not seen and has not asked to see any of Sir Peter Hayman's diaries. These are now in the possession of the DPP, who obtained them from the Metropolitan Police after the publication of the earlier Private Eye, 24th of October 1980, and this was for the purpose of the Security Service investigation. And so, although this note from Sir Thomas Hetherington, the DPP at the time, related to a second article published by Private Eye, was it your understanding throughout that there was no disagreement and no divergence of opinion about process insofar as Peter Hayman is concerned?
Yes, that's my idea, my understanding.
In your statement, your paragraph 18, you say you don't remember. If you kindly go back to that on the 3rd page. Page 3, paragraph 18, I don't remember any reaction by the Prime Minister to that minute. So it's the minute we've looked at, the one that was written the 27th of October 1980. I don't remember any parliamentary questions on the subject. I remember being told, I think, by the security service that there was no reason to suppose that there had ever been any compromise of security as a result of Sir Peter Hayman's sexual activities and propensities. I don't remember whether there was an inquiry into the failure of the positive vetting system, though I seem to remember that the system was strengthened at about that time. Lord Armstrong, it's almost 1 o'clock. It's almost 1 o'clock, and the chair and panel will want to break around now. I'm afraid I'm not finished with your evidence, but I will finish at 2 o'clock. I hope that's not too inconvenient to you. So can I ask you to return at 2 o'clock, please? Thank you very much. You can take the file with you if you wish.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lord Armstrong, would you please go back to tab 14, and when you find that, go to the second page. It's HOM 002203. Put that up on the screen, please.
Which page?
Second page is the beginning of your minutes.
Oh, yes.
The first page of your minute.
Thank you.
And I'd like to ask you about something that appears in the third paragraph, which I read through a little earlier. 4 lines down into paragraph 3, it reads, "The police report showed that Sir Peter Hayman kept explicit and detailed records of his sexual activities and fantasies, and that he was a member of the Paedophile Information Exchange, but the only activities which could be shown to have occurred were with consenting adults of both sexes. The material in the records relating to children appeared all to be fantasy, and there was and is no evidence for actual activities with children." Do you remember now on what basis you were able to conclude that the material about children was fantasy, whereas the material about adults were not?
I was basing that on advice which I had had from those who had read all the material, which I hadn't myself.
And was that the DPP's office or the security service?
I can't
do you
remember.
So it wasn't a conclusion that you yourself had arrived at, but it was one which was based upon information or advice that you'd received from elsewhere,
Yes.
which you were passing on to the Prime Minister. Did the fact that Hayman, using the pseudonym Henderson, was a member of the Paedophile Information Exchange, an organisation whose aims were to lower the age of consent in order to permit sex with children, ring alarm bells? Whether Hayman's diary writings about children were simply fantasy or whether he was actually abusing children as well?
Well, I was advised that there was no evidence that he had been, other than fantasizing about sexual relations with children. And I had no reason to question that.
I know it's a long time ago now, and I suspect I know the answer to this, but did you hear or learn at the time that there was material attributable to Peter Hayman that was also found in St James's Park? The information you had was about material found on a London bus, but material also found in St James's Park, which turned out to include images of boys in underwear, and the boys being aged between 8 and 11?
I didn't know that.
No.
It's the first I've heard of it.
Can I go, please, and ask you to turn back to tab 12, it's that thick file, and this time to go to page 22, please. And the reference for the evidence handler is CAB 000071, page 22. This, Lord Armstrong, is another minute, this one dated the 9th of January 1981, and I think it must follow from the date that it was as a result of, and indeed you make reference to, the second Private Eye article about Peter Heyman. If we read from the top, in my minute of the 27th of October 1980, I described the background to the allegations in a Private Eye article about the sexual activities of Sir Peter Heyman. I said that the Security Service would undertake a full investigation with a view to discovering what was known or suspected about Sir Peter Heyman's activities while he was in the diplomatic service. In view of the further article in last week's Private Eye about Heyman, of which I enclose a copy, so this relates to the second article, I've obtained a progress report on the investigations. The documentary evidence in the possession of the Director of Public Prosecutions, the diaries, which related to the period 1966 to 78, showed that the first Private Eye article in October was generally accurate as far as that period was concerned. There's no reflection of Heyman's sexual activities in his FCO personal files. The Security Service have so far undertaken a total of 14 interviews with present and past FCO and something's redacted officials who were colleagues of Heyman in his various postings from 1959 onwards. It seems from those interviews that, with the exception of 2 incidents which were not reported and might well have seemed insignificant at the time, though they seem more significant with the benefit of hindsight, one during his period in Baghdad in 1959 to 60, and the other in his time as High Commissioner in Ottawa in 1971 to 1974, Heyman gave his colleagues no cause to suspect that he might be engaged in irregular sexual activities. Now, can you tell us, please, Lord Armstrong, does the sentence that I've just read to you from the second paragraph of that minute suggest that in the case of the 2 instances that you give, Baghdad and Ottawa, colleagues did suspect that Heyman was engaged in irregular sexual activities?
I don't remember, I'm afraid.
And do you remember now what you meant by your use of the term irregular sexual activities?
I think that I was referring to his general activities as described in the diaries.
Do you think, looking back now, there is the possibility that a possible implication of the use of the term irregular sexual activities was to include children under the age of consent?
I don't think it was intended to do so. I think it was just irregular sexual activities of outside his marriage.
But of particular deviancy, or simply, or were you talking about sexual affairs?
I was talking about sexual affairs.
And so, when we come to look at this document, Lord Armstrong...
If I had meant children, I think I would have said criminal, or words to that effect.
But when we come back to this document, then, that we should take from the words might be engaged in irregular sexual activities, that is a reference, looking back now, from what you're telling us, to affairs outside marriage.
Well, I have not seen only a small section of the diaries, but the kind of activity described in that section.
All right.
I don't think irregular is intended to point to activities with children, because we had been told that the references to children were all fantasies. There was no evidence of activities with children.
Finally, this, please, if you could turn back to page 15 in that same file, I mean that same section of documentation, please. So go back to 015, please.
16?
15.
15.
And you'll find there a note from Sir Edward Yude relating to Peter Hayman, which begins, "Inquiries into the Hayman case have so far produced no evidence that Sir Peter's activities came to the notice of hostile intelligence agencies. But the point has been reached where, in order to carry the inquiries further, it will be necessary for the Security Service to interview Sir Peter Hayman himself. The Director General and I have discussed how best to arrange this. We're agreed that since Sir Peter Hayman is an ex-member of the diplomatic service, the first approach to him should come from the FCO. I propose, therefore, to invite Sir Peter Hayman to come to see me." And remind us, what was Edward Yude's position at that time? Do you remember?
Well, I don't remember. I assume from this that he was the Director of Personnel, or whatever you call it. They had a special name for it in the Foreign Office, which I've forgotten.
But it was a Foreign Office position.
It's a Foreign Office position.
And so he says, "I propose, therefore, to invite Sir Peter Hayman to come to see me. The Director General will be with me. Quite possible that Sir Peter Hayman will bring with him Sir David Napley, his solicitor, and I will put it to Sir Peter Hayman that our interest is not in his personal activities as such, but as an ex-member of the service, he will understand that in such cases the possible security implications have to be investigated, and for this purpose the Security Service would want to arrange for him to be interviewed by a member of their service. The Security Service interview would be on their premises rather than in the FCO." Do you remember now the fact that there was a Security Service investigation and an interview of him?
Well, I read it in the papers, but
Yeah.
I don't remember it specifically.
And just this, again, I know difficult given the years which have passed, but were you aware whether MI5 investigated any of Hayman's contacts in the paedophile information exchange?
I wasn't aware of that.
No. All right. Forgive me just a moment, please, Lord Armstrong. Those are all the questions I have for you. I'm just going to ask the Chair and the panel if they have any questions.
No, we have no questions. Thank you very much, Lord Armstrong.
Thank you.
Lord Armstrong, thank you for coming. That completes your evidence.
Thank you.
That's very kind of you. Thank you. That's on the record. Thank you.
swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but
and nothing but the truth. Thank you.
Your full name, please.
Giles Daubeny Brandreth.
Mr. Brandreth, you're courteously looking at me, but it would help if you look across towards the panel, although your
Good
voice is
afternoon,
being
panel.
amplified. Now, Mr. Brandreth, you made a statement to the inquiry in June of last year, and it's that which I'm going to use, as it were, as a template to your evidence. The first thing I ask you about is, apart from your journalistic and other television career, could you tell us something about your parliamentary and political background?
Yes, essentially I'm a broadcaster and a writer, but between 1990 and 1997 I had a political career. I aspired to be a Conservative Member of Parliament, and in 1990 began the process of trying to find a seat, secured one in the city of Chester, and became the Member of Parliament for the city of Chester in 1992, and I was there until 1997, when the people spoke in no uncertain terms, and I ceased to be a Member of Parliament.
In other words, you were defeated.
I was defeated.
By Christine Russell,
I
as it
was,
turns
indeed.
out, who was the Labour candidate, and so your time in Parliament lasted 5 years.
5 years.
Parliament. And you did you leave politics at that point?
I did leave politics at that point. I might have returned, but I decided not to. But it was a fascinating period, and I wrote an account of it. I keep a diary, and I wrote published an account of my time in Parliament in a book called Breaking the Code, which is the first sort of extensive account of the workings of the government's whip's office. And as such, some of my colleagues at the whip's office were not happy to see it published, but it was generally well received and has been regarded, I think, by those who were there at the time as being an accurate account of life in politics in the 1990s. And it's still in print, I think, largely because partly because of the whip's office material, but also because it's a reflection of what politics was like in relation to Europe in the 1990s, and there are echoes today.
Republished in 2014.
Yeah.
You covered the years 1990 to 1997 for understandable reasons, but when it was republished, what was the year bracket extended by 10 to 2007?
Yes, the second edition goes to 2007 to make it a little bit more contemporary, from the fall of John Major to the arrival of David Cameron. But I also, in the last edition, I think the paperback edition, added a section, again based on my diary, concerning all the rumours and allegations about Sir Peter Morrison, because at the time it was surfacing in the newspapers, and I was getting a lot of calls about it and inquiries, and I thought, well, let me think this through and set the record straight, putting on paper everything that I knew.
Yep.
So that's what I tried to do. And when last June I was asked to prepare a witness statement for you, I took some care over it, in the sense that I did think back carefully and referred to diaries of the time, so that my witness statement, as it were, may be more rounded and full and complete than some of my off-the-cuff remarks that I'm making to you now.
Yeah. And quite a bit of it does borrow from that afterword, doesn't it?
It does.
In relation to Peter Morrison.
That's when I stopped to think about it, when that new issue was done, and then I thought about it again last year when I had the invitation to give you a witness statement.
And the reason in particular that you wrote the afterword in 2014, or at least it was published in 2014, was there any particular purpose?
The purpose, I think, was because I was being pressed for, what is your response? Did you know? The man was a paedophile. What are you going? What's, etc. And I thought, well, actually, rather than coming out and trying to make a statement, let me calmly think this through and write an account of it in my own time, in my own words, right, which is what I attempted to do. And so when I was invited by you to contribute, obviously I went back to that.
I see. No point, as it were, reinventing the wheel. You'd already cast your mind back. You'd written the afterword based on your memories of that period and
Yes.
Peter Morrison, and
I mean,
therefore...
One of the disadvantages of keeping a diary is that you can't, as it were, change the your view of things. And, of course, we so often look at things through the prism of where we are rather than what it was like at the time.
Absolutely. So can we put up on this screen so that we can all see what you're looking at, because I wish to adduce it, your statement, which is the inquiry reference GBR 000001. As I say, I'm going to use this, as it were, as a template for your evidence. I'm going to come back to the Whip's office a little later, but can we turn immediately to paragraph 12, please, because that's where you come to deal with Peter Morrison.
Yes. Yep.
Now, he was your immediate predecessor in Parliament in the city of Chester. And do you remember now how long he'd been the MP in Chester?
Quite a long while. I knew nothing really about him until I turned up there. The system is you get onto the candidates list and you find a number of seats where you might apply. Chester was one of the seats that I applied to. It was the first I applied to because I had a family connection with that part of the world. I was invited up for the interview. I got through the first round, and then the people at Central Office, which was then the Conservative headquarters, said, "You've got through the second round. They seem to like you up there. But the present incumbent, Sir Peter Morrison, he has reservations about you. You better go and meet him." So that was the first time I met Peter Morrison. I went to his house near Westminster, and I met him for the first time. My first impression of him, immediately you could see that he was somebody who was quite a heavy drinker, heavy smoker. I sensed that he might be homosexual. I didn't know. I asked him directly why he was standing down, because he was only 4 years older than me, though he looked considerably older than me. And he said to me that he'd been a Minister of State, he'd been Parliamentary Private Secretary to the Prime Minister. He couldn't see himself moving any further. It had been made clear to him he wasn't going to join the Cabinet.
Mr. Brentford.
Oh, sorry.
I was almost tempted to say something. I'm not going to say that.
Don't.
I'm going to ask you to
There
stop.
will be, fine. If there's deviation, just press the little button there, okay?
Well, I was going to say just a minute, but I decided against it. But I'm hesitating because these ladies here are typing your evidence, and you're going extremely quickly. So can I ask you just to slow down?
Oh, very good.
A touch.
That's going to be a challenge for us all, but why not?
I'll ask you to slow down, and we'll take your evidence in bite-sized chunks. So
Sure.
you go to meet him in his house near, you remembered, Westminster, and you date this as 1991.
Yes, I mean, I could give you, I've got the diary with me, I could probably give you the precise date.
And you remember that he was stepping down, he was aged 47, is what you say in the statements, and he'd been in Parliament for 18 years.
Correct.
So and in the one seat.
In the one seat.
So a long time, and by this stage, he was a knight and a Privy Councillor.
Correct.
And you remembered in paragraph 12, as is the fact, he'd been a Minister of State and a Parliamentary Private Secretary to the Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher.
Yep.
And this is what I want to ask you. When you asked him why he was giving up politics so relatively young, what did he say to you?
I'll say it as slowly as I can. What he said to me, essentially, was, I've got as far as I'm going to go. I've been a Minister of State, I'm a Privy Councillor, I've been Parliamentary Private Secretary to Margaret Thatcher, a great person. I'm not going to go any further, I can see that. It's time to get out, and I want to make some money.
So to go into business?
To go into business. And I must say, I accepted all that at face value.
At the time, did you have any reason to disbelieve him?
No. None whatsoever.
And when you went to see him, did you go alone?
I went alone. His secretary was there. The house was somewhere like Cowley Street or Lord North Street, somewhere around there. I went upstairs to his sitting room. He introduced me to his secretary, said rather charmingly, "This is the real Member of Parliament for the city of Chester. She does all the work." And he was courteous and pleasant. We were not necessarily people on a similar wavelength. I knew, because I had been told by the people at Central Office, that he did not see me as a suitable successor to him, probably because I was maybe perhaps too middle ground for him. Also, I had no deep party background, and he had been a deputy chairman of the Conservative Party. So he had reservations about me, and I was there to allay those. So I asked him about local issues, what the big concerns were. I did ask him about the local press, and he did say to me, I never speak to them. And my advice to you would be, never speak to them. They're only making trouble.
Yeah.
But I took it to be a friendly meeting, and he certainly, though I knew he wasn't in sympathy with me, he was totally courteous.
But your wife had slightly different instincts about
Not
him.
then, not at that stage.
But sometime afterwards.
The process of becoming a candidate is quite a long one. You go for a series of interviews as you get closer and closer to being in the last three.
Yeah.
And by the time I got down to the last three candidates were myself, a lady who subsequently became a member of Parliament elsewhere, and a young lawyer who was Sir Peter's preferred candidate. He had proposed, I think, and was supporting this young lawyer. And when it came to the final, I came top, and the lady came second, and the young lawyer came third. So he was eliminated, and then it was between the two of us, and I came through. And I would say that my people, once I was there, it became clear that they were ready to move on from Peter. I think I got the impression, because he'd been there a long time, because he was very much associated with Mrs. Thatcher, and there was a new era, because people were concerned about his drinking, and it was self-evident that he was a heavy drinker. And they wanted a family man. That was made clear, that they wanted a family man. Yeah. And there I was with a wife and small children, so that was to my advantage. But there was no suggestion, as it were, of any of the child allegations that we can come on to in a moment at that stage at all. And my wife's instinct was, well, they're clearly ready to move on from him. Right. That was her instinct. And that he was going before he was pushed.
Right. So if he was jumping before he was pushed, which is what you say in paragraph 12 at the end, my wife, whose instinct is always good, said she thought he was jumping before he was pushed. You didn't know the reason why?
Well, I think, actually, no, I didn't know the reason why, but I would have accepted that. I think probably at the time I thought the reason why is he's been here a long time. He clearly was a very heavy drinker. Yeah. He was not a prepossessing figure any longer. He didn't have the support of the local press. And I think those were the reasons as far as I knew at that stage.
So you did not know, and I'll ask you if you ever heard any allegations, local allegations, or stories about some deal which had been hatched in order to allow him to stand down and go away quietly.
Yes, I've read this now in the various statements from different people.
Can we just be clear so that everybody understands who we're talking about? You're talking about Christine Russell, Jane Lee, Graham Nichols, Patricia Green, and Francis Moat.
Correct. And I think you've got witness statements from all of them.
And we've heard from them as well.
We've heard from them as well. And I think, from my recollection, that Christine Russell, who was my successor, she won the election in '97, she does not seem to recall this meeting. Yeah. What is interesting to me is that I never heard about this meeting until all this came up. And I knew, obviously, the senior activists in the local Conservative Party well. I knew some of the Labour people reasonably well. I knew the journalists really quite well, including Cynthia Boddy, whose name comes up here, who was a seasoned local journalist, in my view a good person, and also quite a heavy drinker and smoker. And she and I would gossip a great deal. She never mentioned that to me. So,
So in all the time that you served in Chester, not once did you hear any allegation of that kind?
no, not that there was. My instinct is that they were ready for him to move on, and that his instinct was that he was ready to move on.
Yeah.
He wasn't going to be going any further in politics. He knew that. He knew that. His time was up.
But if, in fact, he had stepped down because there had been a deal between the parties, the press and the police, that never came to your ears?
That never came. And also, I met, as well as the local journalists, the local political activists of all the parties, I also was on good terms with senior people in the local police.
Yeah.
And you chat, you gossip. It did not come up.
All right.
And it wasn't a surprise that it didn't come up. The point I'm really trying to make is that he did seem like an older man, and he was so associated with Mrs. Thatcher. This was a new era, and it would be reasonable, and it had become a marginal seat.
Yeah.
And I think he was aware of that, and he might well have lost. I only won by a majority of 1,000.
So you first met him, you say in your statement, in 1991, in paragraph 13. That's the time that you arrived in Chester, and you say that the casual word on the streets was that he was a disgusting pervert, and as you detailed in your book, out canvassing, knocking on doors in one or other of the large council estates, you were told in no uncertain terms that he was a monster who interfered with children.
Yes.
And was this, as it were, common currency?
It happened sufficiently often for me to register it and to make notes of it in my diary. Once I'd been chosen as the candidate, I was a very active candidate, and my wife and I would go canvassing frequently at weekends, and particularly in the two large estates in Chester, the Blacon estate and the Leitch estate. People would say, "Oh, we're not voting for that disgusting pervert." That's a phrase I remember. I wrote it down at the time. Somebody else called him a monster. It certainly was said by several people on the doorstep. I think at the time, but bear in mind, you're meeting, if any of you have been involved in local politics or national politics, you will know you meet an awful lot of people, you shake an awful lot of hands, people say an awful lot of things that turn out not to be true. And there were slurs cast against Labour people in the community, not of a sexual nature, but slurs nonetheless. And you hear it. I don't think people do say terrible things, and I thought people do say terrible things.
But was the nature and perhaps frequency of this type of thing being said about him sufficient to lend itself to a concern that there might be some truth in it?
No. It was sufficiently noticeable for me to write it in my diary, but it was not of sufficient. I did not think that there was anything in it. I'll tell you what I did think, and that is this. I thought that Peter Morrison was a man from a very conventional background and a distinguished political family, who possibly, I don't even know if he was homosexual, but who gave the impression of having been homosexual, and was drinking and smoking because he was homosexual, and given the era in which he was brought up and his first entry into politics when homosexual acts were, before they were decriminalised, that was an issue for him. To that extent, I might well have had some sympathy with him, because since I had been a child myself, a teenager myself, I was the youngest member of something called the Albany Trust, which was a campaign for homosexual law reform in the 1950s and 1960s. I was conscious that there would be people for whom life had been very difficult. And people do say terrible things. So I thought people were saying terrible things, not sufficiently that everybody was saying it. It happened a few times, but I'm talking perhaps a dozen times. And given that one is canvassing hundreds of doors, I'm talking about a dozen times.
All right, but including allegations that he interfered with children?
Yes. And I think, yes, yes. What does one... I mean, did the phrase kiddie fiddler come up? Is it that sort of thing? I can't really remember that. I can be sure that disgusting pervert was said because I would have written that down on the day.
Yeah.
Also, monster. Whatever I wrote down at the time would have been written on the day.
It's simply, Mr. Brandreth, in your paragraph 13 in the fourth line, Morrison was a monster who interfered with children.
Ah,
so
there
those,
you are,
those
yeah.
are your words.
And the very fact that just now the phrase kiddie fiddler came to mind could well have been that.
You say, and it happened about yourself, that people make up stories. That's what you've been telling us. Repeat them.
Yeah.
But you say, again in paragraph 13, no one offered anything to substantiate these slurs.
Yes. What will have happened is that after a day like that, I might have said, because by then he had disappeared. He wasn't on the scene. He came a couple of times during the election process to support me as the campaign was launched, but then he returned to London. So that he wasn't, as it were, nearby, but probably at the end of the day, I would, after a day's canvassing, I would say, oh, people do say the most terrible things about Peter. But people then didn't say, oh, yeah, and you know it's true, or there's something in it. Or so nobody ever, given the number of people that one spoke to, nobody ever came forward with anything.
Did you ever think to ask any of your police officer friends or acquaintances whether there was anything in it, or whether they'd ever been asked to investigate any such allegations?
I don't think so, but his name would have come up in conversation. No, no.
All right. Can we have a look, please, at the document behind the second tab, which we can put up on screen? The inquiry's seen it before, INQ 003856. Have you got the file there, Mr.
I have,
Brown?
yes.
It will come up on the screen as well. Yeah. And if we go, please, to the foot of the second page. This is Simon Hoggart's diary of the 16th of November 2012. And it refers to Peter Morrison at the foot of that page. No, we need to go to the foot of it, please. On the second page.
We have it here.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get it up on screen.
Crew station of the 15-year-old boy. That's what you're looking for, isn't it?
Graham Nichols, who ran the Chester Trades Council when Morrison was a local MP, wrote describing how he'd often met Morrison, who was by the 1980s pretty well constantly drunk. And he's quoted here, after the 1987 general election around 1990, I attended a meeting of Chester Labour Party where we were informed by the agent Christine Russell that Peter Morrison wouldn't be standing in 1992. He'd been caught in the toilets at Crew Station with a 15-year-old boy. Deals struck between Labour, local Tories, local press and police. That if he stood down at the next election, the matter would go no further. Chester finished up with Giles Brandreth, which sounds rather unfortunate slur on you.
It does, doesn't it? Well, there we are.
Finished up with Giles Brandreth, and Morrison walked away scot-free. Now, do you recognise any of that? Or did you
apart
hear
from the bit of them finishing up with me, which is possibly what the people felt in 1997. No, to be serious, I don't recognise any of this in the sense that, obviously, I knew Christine Russell, I knew Labour people, I knew the local Tories very well, I knew the local press, and I knew the local police. No mention of such a meeting was ever mentioned to me. I had no idea of such a meeting ever having taken place.
Did you ever hear about the Crew Station incident, as alleged?
Not until some years later. No, not at the time at all.
And you say in your paragraph 15, if we go back to your statement, please. Paragraph 15 at the foot of the third page, the first and only official acknowledgement of my predecessor's possible involvement in child abuse came my way in 1996. So this is while you were still in Parliament, when William Hague, who was then Secretary of State for Wales, came up to me in the House of Commons to let you know that he'd ordered an inquiry into allegations of child abuse in care homes in North Wales between 1974 and 1990, and that Peter Morrison's name might feature in connection with the Bryn Estyn home in Wrexham, 12 miles from Chester, and it was Sir Ronald Waterhouse the retired High Court judge who was appointed to head the inquiry, which you say took 3 years, cost apparently £12 million, and was reckoned, at least then, to be the biggest investigation ever held in Britain into allegations of physical, sexual and emotional abuse of children who passed through the care system. And you give some more information about that inquiry, but the only thing I need to ask you was whether, given 200 names, I think, were mentioned in the course of that report, whether Peter Morrison's name ever featured.
As I understand it, Peter Morrison's name did not feature.
And then paragraph 17, you say the accusations against him resurfaced in 2012. We've seen one instance of that in the Simon Hogarth article. Yeah. But Rod Richards, who was then junior minister at the Welsh office when the Waterhouse inquiry was being set up, said publicly that Morrison had been named as a regular and unexplained visitor to Bryn Estyn, and then Channel 4 reported that he had been seen driving away from Bryn Estyn with a boy in his car. The Prime Minister and the Home Secretary then announced further inquiries into both the original inquiry and into any further allegations. Help us, was that just about Peter Morrison, or did other names surface to justify the further inquiries?
I'm afraid I can't remember.
And what you say is, in November 2013, the police announced that in the past year, 235 people had contacted them with information about alleged abuse in care homes in North Wales, and they were pursuing a large number of active lines of inquiry. And then you give some more statistics about a BBC report in July 2014. Paragraph 18, you then mention a Sunday Mirror reporter by the name of Chris House, who received a tip-off from police officers who said that Peter Morrison had twice been caught cottaging in public lavatories with underage boys and had been released with a caution. And this is something that was in the public domain. And you say apparently when House confronted Morrison, Morrison threatened legal action. 10 years later, another investigative journalist, Nick Davies, followed up the story and confirmed with the police that Morrison had indeed been picked up twice, but added there appeared to be no trace of either incident in any of the official records, and you say you never heard any of this in Chester or at Westminster during your time as an MP or during Morrison's lifetime.
Correct.
So the information that you've set out in the statement is clearly not your personal knowledge, but information you've picked up from...
In a sense, what I'm doing here is I'm being a kind of reporter, reporting what I now know, what we now know, in order really to underline the fact that I heard none of this in Chester or at Westminster at the time.
And then you asked the big question.
And I was interested, as it were, having had the matter raised by the Secretary of State for Wales, obviously he'd alerted me to that. I was concerned and I was interested, and wanted, hoped that the inquiry would get to the root of it. And obviously the inquiry was very thoroughgoing, and I was interested that Morrison's name did not then appear.
Now, you then pose for yourself the big question, was there a cover-up? And of course, Mr. Brandreth, you're not privy to information that took place and correspondence that passed between the Security Service, the Cabinet Secretary, Prime Minister, and the Conservative Central Office at that period of time. But from the information that you have and from your knowledge of how Parliament works, tell us from your paragraph 19 what your general view, by way of an answer to that question you've posed for yourself, is.
Well, my instinct was that, yes, there were these stories, and clearly they gained currency, they were repeated, they were obviously, now we discover, of concern to people. But I can't see how anyone I don't believe, knowing how sensitive politicians are to scandal, I don't believe that if anybody had really thought there was anything in any of this, Peter Morrison would have been appointed to the deputy chairmanship of the Conservative Party. I just don't think it would have happened. I think they would have thought, if, we don't want, let's get a blob in our faces, we won't want that. If they felt it was a story. I'm sure if they felt it was true, they would certainly not have wanted, and action would have been taken. But I don't think they felt that they could have believed there was enough in it. So I don't think he would have been appointed a deputy chairman of the Conservative Party.
Do you think there was a risk, certainly at that time, because we know he went on to become Margaret Thatcher's PPS, do you think there was a risk at that time that somebody in Peter Morrison's position who denied the allegations was sufficient for people to accept it rather than inquire more closely?
No. I think, in a way, the Profumo affair put an end to that. I think a blanket denial, no. I don't think, no. I think in the whip's office, sometimes you'd say if somebody denies it too strenuously, you think, he does protest too much. Yeah. So no, I don't think, as it were, what I don't think is on the basis of, if a chap like him said he didn't do it, then he didn't do it. I don't think that would have washed at all. Maybe I'm anticipating your next question, because I did discuss this later with Baroness Thatcher at a social occasion where she and I were talking about Sir Peter, and it was clear to me that she remembered him with affection, that she knew that he was a heavy drinker. I think she assumed that he was gay, and she did say that he'd rather ruined himself, by which she meant the drink, I'm sure. She likened him to Reginald Maudling. I remember that, again, because of my diaries.
And for those of us who don't remember
Reginald Maudling, who was Chancellor of the Exchequer and Home Secretary many years ago, and also was rather fond of drinking. There's no other untoward suggestion in relation to him.
No.
And so my impression was that that's why she... but having known her over a number of years, it is inconceivable to me that had Baroness Thatcher thought that Peter Morrison was in any way a paedophile or an abuser of children, that she would have countenanced the possibility of him becoming her PPS, or indeed having her approval as a member of Parliament. It just seems to me to be inconceivable. And we talked openly about Peter for a proper chat about him.
Is there a risk in her acceptance of him as her PPS in 1990, for example? Is that based upon those who advise her? In other words, as Prime Minister at that time, if she was thinking of appointing Peter Morrison as her PPS, would she have looked at others for information?
Yes,
just to ensure that there were no risks about appointing him to such a sensitive position?
The way the Whip's office works is that promotions come with knowledge, so that there is a sort of system whereby each year you review ministers and members of Parliament, and you assess who they are, where they're going, what their prospects are, what they've got to offer, etc. And if there are any concerns about them, those would be known. I don't think, but also you choose as your parliamentary private secretary, because that's quite a personal relationship. You would choose almost certainly somebody you already knew, liked, and felt you could be comfortable spending time with.
But there was surely a risk here with this man, because we know that in November 1986 there were certainly rumours that weren't going away that he had a penchant for small boys, none of which was properly investigated, none of which was presented to the police to investigate. And so the question arises, why would Prime Minister Thatcher have taken on trust that he was sufficiently safe to have in such a sensitive and close position, without a thorough investigation into rumours as awful as those?
I do not know the answer to that, but if you want me to speculate, a lot of the turns of phrase that are used here, and this is why your definition correctly of a child for this investigation is under the age of 18, I think, the age of consent. People use the phrase, like young. This is period talk, young boys, lads, etc., and they might well be thinking of teenagers, people aged 17, 18, 19, 20. Which might be considered very different from children, which people might consider 12, 13, 14, 15. I'm not here to debate that
I
with
understand
you,
that.
but I'm trying to explain that if you're wanting to get a flavour of the kind of talk of the time, people will say, well, he's got quite an interest in boys, that could be a kind of coded way of speaking that he is actually gay, going back 30 or 40 years in the language of the time.
Understand that, but do you agree, even though we accept you're speculating without direct knowledge, but wasn't there always a risk that without proper investigation, a penchant for small boys at its worst could mean literally that, small boys?
Well, I don't know, but I can imagine Mrs. Thatcher saying, can that be true? And being told, well, we don't think so. If Thatcher thought for a moment that it was true, I don't think she would have appointed him, and I'm sure she would in fact have said, we've got to do something about
it. In actual fact, according to Lord Armstrong, when letters were being written about what the security services might take by way of steps to investigate, which included the chief whip of the time speaking to Donald Stewart, who was an agent in Westminster, according to Lord Armstrong, it was Margaret Thatcher's view that that didn't need to happen. Does that surprise you?
It does surprise me, really, yeah. I think it
because here the security service, and we know the date was the 4th of November 1986, was advising the Cabinet Secretary that these are the steps that we can take. Within 14 days, the whole thing was effectively put to bed. With Margaret Thatcher, apparently, according to Lord Armstrong, suggesting that that step did not need to be taken. And why does it surprise you?
Because there's no question that I would have thought any member of Parliament, particularly Mrs. Thatcher, would find the notion of child abuse totally abhorrent. And anybody would. And would not want to condone it in any shape or form. And I don't believe that party interest or political interest would override that. Mrs. Thatcher was not judgmental when it came to people's private lives, so that irregularities, to use the Lord Armstrong's phrase, might be tolerated, but criminal activity would not be tolerated.
You accept that there was still a risk, and if there was a risk, would that have been purely political embarrassment, or were there other risks generally in having somebody as your PPS or somebody in a sensitive position like that, who might, if the allegations are true, be a paedophile?
Well, it would be totally foolhardy. I mean, it would A, be wrong, but also politically it would be a foolhardy thing to do to appoint someone if you thought there was any possibility that they were going to be exposed, or even that it would be alleged against them. I mean, I'm assuming, but I really don't know, and I'm speculating, I'm assuming that Mrs. Thatcher had thought there was nothing in it. I mean, I will repeat what I said earlier, is that people do say the most terrible things. Well, you know this full well because of terrible things that have been said that you've been looking at, that you've had to bat away and dismiss. People say terrible things, so that if you are a member of Parliament, you will hear terrible things spoken about many of your colleagues. So that it's quite easy to feel, well, there's no evidence of this. I've known him for years. Let's carry on.
Do you think, looking back, that the better thing to have done was for there to have been a proper police investigation into these allegations to see if there was any truth in them?
Yes, of course. Absolutely. And I think what is interesting is that there's so much hearsay and rumour and gossip. I think the interesting thing is the case of Crewe Station, that not being followed through. And now what we've learnt about the secret services and all of that, I'm surprised that nothing more thorough was done.
Yeah. Right, well, let's turn, please, now to the Whip's office. Mr. Morrison himself, or Sir Peter as he became, and I'm looking at your paragraph 22, did he ever serve in the Whip's office?
Yes, he did.
For any length of time?
Yes, he was a whip, and I think he became a Lord Commissioner of the Treasury, which is a senior whip, which I eventually became, and he was the pairing whip as well. Yes.
And so he understood the whip's office.
Yes. He was an old-school patrician conservative politician from a old-school conservative family. And he knew his way around Westminster. He had the strengths of that and also the disadvantages of that, in that it could irritate a lot of people, and you could turn him into a caricature quite easily because of it.
And you say in your paragraph 22 of the statement, whips do look after their own.
Yes.
In terms of sticking together, doing former whips favours, excusing them from certain votes to let them slip home early, helping them secure a place on a preferred committee, giving them access to a minister that they particularly want to see, helping their promotion prospects by putting in a good word, but you emphasise, not certainly in my experience, you say covering up criminal behaviour,
yes,
which is something you've already said. And so you do not countenance, you've spoken about what Margaret Thatcher would not have countenanced, but you do not countenance the possibility that he was protected by the whips or anyone else.
I would be surprised. Certainly there was nothing of that in my time there. The essence of the whip's office, as I'm sure you understand, is that the main party, the government whip's office, is about 14 individuals, and it is their responsibility to be both managers of the business of Parliament and also a kind of human resources arm of Parliament, and they look after a group of people in their part of the country that they take a particular interest in, and they also are attached to certain government departments. And the idea is that you get to know the people who are within your flock. You understand what their ambitions are, what their hopes are, what their capabilities are, and what their problems are, so that you have a rounded view of them, in order both to assist them if they need assistance, and also to be able to ensure that you understand them and can secure their votes when you need their votes. So that's what the whip's office does, and you keep your ear to the ground, and you report in whatever you hear about people into the system. So, but my experience was that certainly you would, if there was you would help people, and I give a couple of examples, I think, in my witness statement. There was somebody, for example, I heard from a local journalist that the local paper in his area had seen him at a gay bar and was going to write a story about it. And I went to see him and I said, I heard from this local journalist. The person, incidentally, denied it. And I thought, well, I know, I think the journalist is telling me the truth and the MP isn't. But I warned him, I said, look, this is going to blow up in the papers. Your private life is your own affair. Just letting you know. That sort of thing would go on. But we would help people. But I know of no example in my time, the years I was there, of any possibility of covering up for somebody who had committed a criminal offence.
Can we look at your paragraph 6? Because you were asked to comment on remarks which were made in 1995 in a BBC documentary, Westminster Secret Service, by a former whip, Tim Fortescue, who was MP for Liverpool Garston between 1966 and 1974, who said anyone with any sense who was in trouble would come to the whips and tell them the truth and say, now I'm in a jam, can you help? It might be debt, it might be a scandal involving small boys, or any kind of scandal in which a member seemed likely to be mixed up in. They'd come and ask if we could help, and if we could, we did. And we would do everything we can, because we would store up brownie points. And if I mean that sounds a pretty nasty reason, but it's one of the reasons, because if we could get a chap out of trouble, then he will do as we ask forevermore. A scandal involving small boys, always difficult to interpret what somebody else means by something. And clearly you're right, he can't have been thinking about Peter Morrison, because Tim Fortescue was a whip more than 40 years ago, at the beginning of the 70s, long before Peter Morrison was even an MP. Is it possible he had, do you think, another case or cases in mind?
It's certainly possible. It's certainly possible. I do not know. But as I point out, also, what I do know is the way people talk or used to talk. And of course, one of the things that clearly you are having to do is explore a culture. There is, I know, a feeling amongst people that there's a kind of world that is going on where this kind of easy collusion can go on. And the language here comes from another world. We were talking about being in a jam, you know, the chap's brownie points, being caught with your trousers down, that kind of talk. A scandal involving small boys could simply be a turn of phrase. I'm not saying it is. There may well have been such a scandal. I do not know of it. And I do know that in the Whip's office we gossiped a great deal and we mulled over some of the scandals of yesteryear. And you may remember the 1990s. There was a lot of sex scandals, in quotes, during John Major's years as Prime Minister. They were constantly and we gossiped and talked. And all I will say is that these scandals, or ones involving small boys, in my recollection, were never mentioned in relation to that era, or indeed to the Peter Morrison era. I never heard about any such scandal.
But as you've said, you accept that in Tim Fortescue's case, there is the possibility that he was talking about
a specific,
not a generic situation, but a specific case.
Yes. But this is the dilemma. People say terrible things, but people also do terrible things. I picked out the diaries of it's actually irrelevant. I was going to say the diaries of a Labour MP from the 1940s and 1950s, Tom Dryburgh, which has got accounts of, in quotes, cottaging involving young men. And the point is, these things do happen. They do happen. We know that.
You say in your paragraph 10, in the centre of that paragraph, you never heard any allegations concerning child sexual abuse relating to any MP of any party serving in the 1992-97 Parliament.
Correct.
And so that's your distinct recollection as far as you're
concerned. It is my
concerned.
Distinct recollection, yes.
That never came to your ears. What were your views about Mr. Ryder and Mr. Goodlad, or Lord Ryder and Lord Goodlad, because they were chief whips around your period of time?
Yes. My views are very clear on them, knowing both of them. I do not believe that either of them would for a moment have considered covering up a case of child sexual abuse had they been made aware of it. Not for a moment.
I'm now going to ask you about how...
Also, if I can make a point, forgive me for interrupting you.
Not at all.
While there might be banter in the Whip's office, and while, as it were, I know some of the... This is why I prefer my statement to making conversation about it. While there might have been banter in the Whip's office, something like this would have been taken very seriously indeed. This wouldn't have been... We wouldn't have shrugged our shoulders and said, oh, you know, Peter Morrison child, it would have been considered shocking.
Yeah.
I mean, these people in the whip's office were also, in my day, they were all a woman became a member of the whip's office, and Jackie Lay, in fact, the person who was the other candidate when I was first standing in Chester. But it was an all-male society. But they were fathers, they were husbands, they were concerned individuals in Parliament for the public good. I never came across a conversation of any kind, not just to do with sexual abuse, but say financial malpractice, where anybody would have possibly countenanced breaking the law. I think there was an awareness in Parliament that what we are about is making the law. And there was a real concern. For example, the equalisation of the age of consent happened during my time. And people really talked about it and felt the protection of young adults who were still, in many ways, children. And I remember in my constituency, I voted for the equalisation, the lowering of the age to equalise the age of consent. And I was actually physically attacked by a Conservative activist for doing this, for voting, because they felt it was making children more vulnerable. So, you know, what I'm trying to say to you is, I'm not saying this lightly. I'm saying that I think at the root of what, for all the banter, badinage, and drinking and quaffing and using these terms of phrase, actually, fundamentally, people are in there for a decent purpose and do it decently. And certainly in the case of these two chief whips, and they are the person who is the conduit between the whip's office and the Prime Minister, I can't picture straighter people in the old-fashioned sense of the term than those two, and so I'm sure they wouldn't have countenanced for a moment.
Well, let me ask you, thank you, something about, at least as you recall it, the way things were recorded in the whip's office, and perhaps we can go to your book for this. If you go behind divider 10,
yeah.
And we can put up on screen INQ 004169, page 4. Divider 10, it's page 325 in the book itself. And at the foot of the page, you write about 20 minutes into the meeting, the chief arrives, so you're describing a meeting, clambers over the outstretched legs of the junior whips, makes his way to his chair facing the deputy. In his hand he has the whip's notes, which he proceeds to read out aloud. This, I understand, is as close as we get to the fabled black book. Was there ever a black book?
No. Essentially what it is, there were notes that there were some folders, not folders, notepads, like the ones that one had for putting accounts in with carbon paper. This rather dates everything. And so you would write whatever notes you had. You would tear off, as it were, one copy, so the carbon would stay in the book, and the bit you tore off, you handed in to the deputy chief whip, as I recall, who then passed it to the chief whip, who would then go through them and share anything that he thought was useful with the Prime Minister.
So, well, why did you call it a fabled black book?
Oh, because one of the reasons that I published my diaries is that the idea of mystery and magic, the mystique of the whip's office, it encourages people to feel that there are dark goings on, and everything, you know, that people love to feel that there is a black book. I don't know when House of Cards was first published and shown on television, but I think it was before my time as an MP. But that kind, you know, the idea of a Machiavellian chief whip with a black book plays into the cartoon version of politics. And the reality is a bit more banal. It is this little book with these torn-out pages. And basically, on it you would write notes, mostly of the variety of so-and-so doesn't like Clause 3 in the amendment to the Education Act that we're trying to put through, and we've got to do something, get him a meeting with the junior minister. That was mostly the tenor of it. But also, you were supposed to, and you did, record gossip or hearsay, you know, here so-and-so is drinking too much, understand it's got financial difficulties. Those sorts of things you would also put in.
You said at page 388 of your book, which for our purposes is 2 pages on, in the inquiry reference, page 6, so if you turn on just one page,
Yep.
and you'll see page 388, Mr. Brandreth, under the heading Later. Do you see you're talking about a new policy on Whip's notes? Yeah. And at the end of that paragraph, sleep easy, boys. From now on, the notes will be shredded on a regular basis. What was that about?
That was about somebody having, was it David Willits or somebody? I don't know. I can't remember who it was, which David. There were quite a few Davids. Anyway, somebody's note had got into the public domain, and he'd used a turn of phrase that was considered unfortunate in the public domain, and therefore it became a newspaper brouhaha. What are we going to do? Well, we've got to communicate in note form, because how else are we going to, there are 14 of us, we've got to feed the information in somehow. The idea is to record it as soon as you hear it. The idea being you'd pick up a bit of gossip, you would go to the Whip's office, you would find the books kept in the safe, an amusing note to throw in here because it's the middle of the afternoon. We could never remember the number of the safe to open it. The number was actually the date of the Prime Minister's birthday. We could never remember the Prime Minister's birthday, so we kept a copy of Who's Who on top of the safe. We'd produce the Who's Who, we'd look up John Major, we'd find out his date of birth, and then we would work out, is it that, do we put the month before the day? Anyway, this is the level of it, and we would open the safe, and then we would find the so-called black book, this little notebook in which we would record what we recorded.
But why the shredding?
The shredding, so that the idea was that, don't worry, it won't get back to you. You won't be fingered as our colleague was, as having...
And shredding took place
I don't know if the shredding ever took place.
So boys couldn't sleep easy then?
Well, that's a turn of phrase. I mean, the problem, in a sense of, as it were, talking to me, is that I'm a diarist and a journalist, and, it's a turn of phrase.
Dramatic license.
A dramatic license there. I don't know if the... and indeed, actually, you do need to gather information.
Yeah.
On the whole, my view of the Whip's office is that it provides a good service and is a caring group of people.
On the next page, the final page that we have copied here, 523, page 17 of this document, really about the views on the book that you published. I broke the Whip's code of silence, something no Whip had ever done before. Whips never talk about what they do or how they set about it. That's the rule. As the Chief Whip pointed out to me at the time, our mystery is part of our potency, and I imagine that's what you were just describing. But mystery makes for mischief.
Yeah.
Do we want government run like an episode of House of Cards? The trouble with operating in secret is that it encourages those not in the know to believe that dark deeds are being done in the murky corridors of power. Occasionally, perhaps they are, but mostly they are not. So I imagine it depends on who you talk to and what's being discussed.
Yes.
But that's your overview. It's a place of mystery. The mystery is part of the potency. Mystery makes for mischief. Occasionally mischief was done, but not always, I imagine, is the conclusion that one draws from that final passage.
I feel sorry that I can't be more helpful to you on being specific,
your experience is your experience.
Yeah, I heard gossip, I heard rumour, but I heard nothing of substance from fellow MPs, from local politicians, from national politicians, from the local press, from the local police. Yeah. And I do believe that if there had been evidence, there would have been action.
Yeah.
That's my instinct.
Finally, as far as I'm concerned, Mr. Brandreth, are you familiar with what Norman Tebbit said to Andrew Marr on the 6th of July 2014 in a programme?
Yes, because somebody sent it to me. He said that there might well have been something.
Covers up in the 1980s, which was spectacularly wrong, but he said it happened and one had to see it against the Times.
Yes.
Now, this was Norman Tebbit, who was the chairman of the Tory party between September 1985 to June 1987, and one would have thought he knew a thing or two. It happens to dovetail with the time that Peter Morrison himself was the deputy chair. Any reason to doubt Norman Tebbit when he says there were cover-ups?
No. No reason at all. I wasn't there.
No.
I did not know. And
No.
one's hope is that you will be able to get to the bottom of some of this, if not all of this, to, as it were, evaporate some of the mystique, make people feel confident that good people are trying to do good work and that there aren't cover-ups. But there may well have been. All I can tell you is that I had no direct experience of them.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Brandreth. I'll ask the chair to see if she or any of her colleagues have any questions.
No, we have no questions. Thank you very much, Mr. Brandreth.
Thank you
Mr. Brandreth,
very much.
thank you very much for coming.
Echo Lord Armstrong. Good luck with your endeavours, and thank you for doing it.
Yes, thank you very much for that. Chair, I note it's 3:15. We don't have any other live witnesses this afternoon, but I think Mr. Henderson is going to adduce some statements, which will probably take a few minutes. Entirely in your hands if you want to do that now, or take a break and come back at 3:30.
We'll hear from Mr. Henderson and then close for the day.
Chair, we want to adduce a few more statements, with your permission, that essentially complete the evidence regarding Sir Peter Morrison that you've been hearing today and indeed yesterday. The first is a witness statement, a series of 3 witness statements from Edwina Curry-Jones. You'll recall, Chair, we heard some evidence in the opening submissions about that, and it was referenced yesterday. Ms Curry-Jones explains and comments on the reference she made to Peter Morrison in her diaries, her published diaries, particularly the reference to him being a noted pederast. And she comments and explains on that further. The references for those are INQ 003867, INQ 003995, and OHY 006572. The second statement is from Mr. Paul Connew. Mr. Connew is a journalist. He was at one time the editor of the Sunday Mirror, and he spoke to several police officers regarding allegations made against both Cyril Smith and Peter Morrison. And he gives his view on those allegations and on the likelihood of there being a political cover-up. The reference for that is INQ 003587. We then have some statements from a Mr. Barry Strevens. Mr. Strevens was the former personal protection officer to Margaret Thatcher when she was Prime Minister. And he recalls hearing some allegations about Peter Morrison directly from the Assistant Chief Constable of Cheshire Constabulary in his capacity as PPO. And that he passed that on to Mrs. Thatcher, and she spoke to Lord Hamilton, Archie Hamilton, her PPS at the time. That statement, those 2 statements, in fact, are INQ 003986 and OHY 006477. We then have a series of statements from Lord Hamilton dealing with precisely the same point, Chair. He confirms the essence of Mr. Strevens' evidence, but says that he hadn't understood there to be an allegation of child abuse against Mr. Morrison, and so there was no real further action taken. And we have 4 statements from Lord Hamilton. INQ 003985, OHY 005426, OHY 005429, and OHY 006588. And then finally, there is a statement from Nick Davis, another journalist, who also heard allegations about Mr. Morrison being caught in public toilets with a boy and only receiving a caution from police. And he gives his account at OHY 005428. We'd invite you to adduce all of those statements in full, Chair.
Yes, I'll do that.
Well, Chair, that's the end of the programme for today. Dramatically early, but nobody's going to complain, I suspect. Tomorrow, Baroness Brinton, Des Wilson and Lord Steele.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank
Altman.